The best way to get into a relationship is our absolutely free choice that is not born out of any calculation or any reasoning, but some pure impulsive choice. It's going to bring beauty and artistry and meaning into our existence, and it's going to try to fill the role that Romanticism tried to fill and failed to fill, which was to take the role of God and history and philosophy and projects of self-transcendence, and we try to pack this all onto that person, and no person can bear that. The philosophical position and its implicit theories of epistemology and psychology, I think, is pretty much completely bankrupt.
Hey audience, we've got a very special episode for you today. John Vervaeke is joining us as a guest, and we're going to be talking about love, dating, and relationships in the age of the meaning crisis.
John Vervaeke is a psychologist and cognitive scientist at the University of Toronto. He is a founder of the Consciousness and Wisdom Studies Lab and has co-written a book called Zombies in Western Culture, a 21st Century Crisis. He's currently releasing a 50-part online course called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which traces the philosophical history of how we've come to find ourselves in a culture which both hungers for meaning and seems unable to find it. The course then brings cognitive scientific tools to the table to help deal with the meaning crisis. To learn more about the meaning crisis, please check out John's excellent series on the topic.
John Vervaeke's ideas, we think, are at the cutting edge of wisdom studies and the social crisis taking place around us, and we're very honored to have him on the show. Today, we're going to be taking a look at an area where the meaning crisis has erupted from beneath the surface, like an open wound. We'll be looking at love, relationships, and dating. Love has become a nexus point of the meaning crisis since, as you point out in your lecture series, John, many people view it as the most important area of their lives, but also the most fraught.
Millennials in particular seem to struggle with romance, with the University of Chicago's General Social Survey reporting that the percentage of Americans 18 to 34 without a steady partner is now at 51% as of 2018. That's the highest percentage since reporting started in 1986. Many millennials are questioning traditional institutions like marriage, struggling to find real meaningful love, and in some cases, giving up on dating altogether. The first half of the episode will focus on how we've come to understand love, dating, and relationship in modern society, and the second half will focus on the nature of romantic love itself.
So when approaching this topic, I feel some hesitation. I wonder if by focusing on it, we're reinforcing our society's pedestalization of romantic love as the ultimate source of meaning in life. So John, I was wondering if you could speak to this romantic tendency, and the four of us could have a discussion on how to talk about love, relationships, and dating without unconsciously falling into it.
Thank you, Ariel, and thank you, all of you, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for having me here. I really appreciate it. I like what the Multiversity is doing. So, yeah, I think in order to talk about this topic of romantic relationships, I think we need to spend a little bit of time on Romanticism and how I argue Romanticism arose within the genealogy of the meaning crisis, and I think is an attempt, I think mostly a failed attempt, to respond to the meaning crisis. So I want to talk a little bit about what that is, and then how it got sort of focused into just what we now call romantic relationships. Because originally Romanticism was a comprehensive philosophy that was intending to be a philosophy of life and something comparable in scope and power to the Christianity that it often consciously sought to replace. So Romanticism is an idea that was born pretty directly out of Kant's philosophy. I won't get into too much detail about it, but one of the main ideas of Kant's philosophy, what he called his Copernican revolution, was his idea that the mind imposes a lot of categories on the incoming information in order to make sense of them and make them available to reason. And that process, I argue elsewhere, I think that process overlaps with some modern cognitive science about relevance realization, but we can come back to that perhaps. And then the idea is everything that we experience in terms of this process of rationalization, not in the Freudian sense, but in the sense of making experience have an intelligible structure that is available to reason. So making sense, making a very strong sense of making sense for us, so that our experience is meaningfully structured And then our conceptual world is meaningfully constructed, structured, and those constructions are meaningfully consonant with each other. Now, of course, we make mistakes and we have to do correction, but the point is there's this underlying framework that makes all of this intelligibility possible. And then what Kant argued, a consequence from that is we can never be aware of the thing, what he called the thing in itself. We can never be aware of the things as they are. He had inherited a long heritage, I think, that goes back to Occam, that the world in some sense was non-rational or even potentially absurd in and of itself because it was beyond sort of human categorization in and of itself. And so every object in the world or in reality, if we can use those terms a little loosely, was not directly available to us. So we lost any sense. It had already been significantly withering and withdrawing through a history I trace in the series, but we lost any sense that was so palpable and powerful and central, prominent in the ancient world of the mind being in contact and being able to conform to and identify with the world in important ways. Instead, with the Kantian revolution, that contact with the world was completely severed. And Kant saw this was important for trying to understand why a priori knowledge worked, why math worked. He was really he was tackling a very hard problem of why does math work so well at explaining the world? Well, one is the ancient Platonic answer. The world is somehow structured by real patterns that ground the mathematics. So that's a realism answer you find in Plato. But by the time we get to Kant, that Platonic metaphysics had collapsed for very many reasons. And so Kant proposed the alternative is that the reason why math works is basically the mind mathematizes information, and that's why math explains the world so well. So he's trying to solve a problem that's central to explaining the success of science, and he's trying to explain why math has this a priori status, and he's trying to do that without trying to bring back what he and many people by his time had considered a largely rejected Platonism. Now, all of that put together, I'm just trying to show that there was deep reasons for what he was doing. All of that put together meant that we had lost this long-standing tradition, which I think also has a good basis in cognitive science, of seeing cognition as in what Charles Taylor calls a contact epistemology. The mind is in contact, conformed. It's co-identifying with the world. The world and the mind are sort of taking on the same structural functional organization. And what that means is that's a devastating place to come to, because I think one of the central insights that helped power the Platonic view originally was the fact that human beings, and I think for good cognitive science reasons having to do with the embodied and embedded and enacted nature and cognition, have a very powerful drive to get a sense of contact with reality. That's why we carry this phrase around, being in touch with reality, being in touch with things. And so that need, that existential need to feel, and this is one of the things that predicts meaning in life, that need to feel connected to what's real and to have a sense of its, have a direct experiential sense of its realness, had to be met in another way. And the Romantics, they take this notion that we are constructing, and they pick up the religious heritage in which will has become increasingly more important. And then they, and Rousseau puts it together and you get the idea of expression, that any meaning we're finding is we're creating and we're projecting it onto the world because Kant has already licensed that with his whole framework. And then they added something new to it. Well, not only are we making meaning, there is a place within the mind in which we can get into contact, because if the emergence of reason is the process by which, through this mathematization, we are removed from contact, if I can get into the more primordial aspects of the mind, the pre-rational and irrational aspects of the mind, I will get closer back to that contact with reality. So these come together, right, of course, in the valorization of the artist as the place in which meaning in life is going to be found. Because the artist is it's an act of will, it's an act of projection, making a project, creating. and the artist is coming into contact with reality through the irrational aspects of the psyche and the mind. And you get the idea, of the madness of the artist and, the mad genius, and that the artist works in this completely intuitive, expressive fashion, which we now take to be second nature. If you look at how art is perceived and understood before that's not the standard view of art. And what this is an attempt to do is it's an attempt to give people something that the ancient philosophical schools and the wisdom institutions and the religious institutions within Christianity had been providing people, this sense of contact with themselves, with each other, and the world. And so Romanticism spread very powerfully because there was really a vacuum for it, and it became a very pervasive thing. And it had a huge influence, for example, through Rousseau, on the French Revolution and the disasters that ensued around that. Now, because of the French Revolution and the defeat of Napoleon, right, and the rise of the conservative oligarchies in Europe, and because of the advent of the Industrial Revolution, and because Newtonian physics was really starting to take off, Romanticism starts to go on the defensive and then the decline, and it withdraws largely through sort of Gothic forms and other forms. It withdraws into what we would now call, romantic relationships, the one place in which people still feel, well, the two places, and they overlap in kind of complex ways. The two places where Romanticism is still somehow right, and I put that in quotes because it's not clear what that means, is in our art and in what we now call our romantic relationships. Somehow in our relationships, we are supposed to be able to get access to aspects of the psyche that are not rational, yet nevertheless put us into contact with our true selves and allow us to express ourselves as completely as we can, right? And to come into real contact with a real person and their real self. This is going to be an artistic endeavor, and those non-rational or irrational aspects of reality are somehow complicit. They will help draw us together. And the act of will is central to our sexual relationships. The best way to get into a relationship is our absolutely free choice that is not born out of any calculation or any reasoning, but some pure impulsive choice, a pure act of will, right? And that's going to get us into a contact with reality. It's going to bring beauty and artistry and meaning into our existence. And it's going to try to fill the role that Romanticism tried to fill and failed to fill, which was to take the role of God and history and philosophy and projects of self-transcendence. And we try to pack this all onto that person, and no person can bear that. And no person can bear. So two reasons. No person can bear that. That's just an unbearable responsibility. And secondly, the philosophical position and its implicit theories of epistemology and psychology, I think is pretty much completely bankrupt. And so I think it's pretty much doomed to fail as a philosophical foundation. And then psychologically, it's doomed to fail because no human being can bear that burden. And so I think that very well explains this, what otherwise seems paradoxical. We invest so much hope in our romantic relationships, and yet, and some of the data you cited, and there's more, we find so much failure and frustration in accelerating rates within them and about them, as such that the culture is now in this very weird place where it has created this really strange and popular genre, which I think I'll use this term, it's meant to be a little bit hyperbolic, but not completely, which I think is evil. And that's romantic comedies. Because romantic comedies bring in all this metaphysical machinery, of these people, and they're being drawn together, and it's all expressive and it's artistic, but there's struggle, but they have to choose, right? But reality assists them, right? And it's drawn all together, but it's a comedy because we know there's something absurd and ridiculous about this proposal. And if we tried to present it straight, people would go, ugh. So we throw in the comedy so they get some distance so that they can bullshit themselves as, I know this is just a comedy, but of course they're bullshitting themselves. And that's why this genre, which, I mean, if you look at it, sort of third person, it's like, wow, this is a very bizarre thing to be doing. It's like somebody who, would be juxtaposing other things we would find absurd together. Like, I don't know, a funeral and a birthday party or something. It's like really strange if you try and think of it from the outside that we put those two things together. I mean, Romanticism didn't ally itself with comedy. It took itself very, very seriously, like deeply seriously, until the point where, it helped engender the French Revolution. So that fact, amongst other facts, the existence of the genre and the data about the height of our hopes and the depths of our failure points to the fact that I think Romanticism is actually very decadent in our culture. I tend to be a little bit, and I've tried to apologize for that and be more corrective, I tend to be a little bit too imprecise. I tend to criticize Romanticism as a whole. And I think there's value. There was important stuff that occurred within Romanticism, especially the early post-Kantians, like Schelling and others, or Schlegel and others. But to be more precise, what I'm very critical now of what I would more precisely call decadent Romanticism, which I think is clearly present, and infecting and inflecting romantic relationships and expressing itself in the genre of the romantic comedy that we never seem to tire of. We tire of other genres. We're getting tired of the superheroes. You can tell people they're starting to get superhero fatigue, right? And we're tired of Star Wars and the zombie. We're even getting tired of the zombie, the symbol of our deep existential tiredness. We're now getting tired of it, right? But man, romantic comedies, just put in another couple of new rising stars that have not yet appeared together. Put out the same right? We just don't tire of it. And so that's where I think we're at. I'm sorry, that was a bit of a long thing, but I wanted to try and answer your question thoroughly.
No, that was great. There's a lot to dig into there. So just to clarify, you think that there's, I guess, several problems with Romanticism, but one of your problems with it is that it has this epistemological bankruptcy, which lends it to failure when people put it into practice.
Yeah.
What would you say? Do you have a conception of what you think would be the right way to approach romance, or can we only just say, well, this is clearly wrong?
Oh no, I mean, I think we're stuck with the word romance, which is unfair because it always prejudices everything we're going to say in favor of Romanticism. I would like to create a new adjective, that takes the place of romance, but it has the same referent. So I don't know what it is, and I don't have enough artistry to propose one. Yeah, part of what I'd like to dig into with you guys today is a couple things. Part of it is, that bankrupt epistemology overlaps with sapiential issues, sapience having to do with the cultivation of wisdom. What I mean by that is, not only do I think, is there a bankrupt epistemology in there, I think the Romantics' separation of rationality, antithetical separation of rationality from romance, such that the idea that, reason should play any significant role in romance and that love should have any significant role in reason is like, what? That's crazy. When of course it was, it was a central idea in the Platonic worldview. So it's not natural. That's a historical separation, even though people find it second nature.
Gotcha. So you find it the modern conceptions of romance to be too irrational.
Well, and that's exactly what I want to say. The separation, but not in the romantic sense that let's glory in the irrational. I think in the very dangerous sense that if you understand reason not as some sort of inferential fascist in your head, but if you understand it instead as what it is. I mean, rationality is about finding the most reliable means to achieve the goals we want. Well, that's one part of it. And what I think the goal we're trying to achieve is a systematic response to self-deception. So I would say that rationality is ultimately trying to find reliable, systematic responses to self-deception. And why anybody would not want that is unclear to me. It's deeply unclear to me why you wouldn't want that. But what comes out of that is the degree to which Romanticism separates itself from the cultivation of rationality and, dare I say it, wisdom, is the degree to which people are flinging themselves into an arena in which self-deception basically has a free hand, which helps explain a lot of what goes on in the disasters within our romantic relationship. And then the fact that we have a bankrupt epistemology, and those two things support each other, right? The sapiential failure and the bankrupt epistemology also helps to explain, right, why it's going wrong, because it's purporting to give us knowledge which it doesn't have. It's purporting to tell you that your gut, whatever the hell that is, your gut can somehow tell you who your true self is, and then you need to be true to that true self. I mean, think about how far we've come from, Socrates, one of the towering figures of wisdom, really, this is a hard project, know thyself. This is something you have to work at with your very best faculties and struggle with for a lifetime before you get, something like this going. And yet, no, I just go, oh, there I am. And it's like, what? That's just incredible. That's just incredible. It's arrogant, right? It's really deeply arrogant.
But it seems to me like love and romance has almost been elevated, and you alluded to this too, almost to like a supernatural kind of level. Like love is just supposed to strike you out of somewhere. And then you said in your episode about romanticism too, that we've placed the role of the romantic partner as someone who's supposed to fulfill like all of the meaning needs that philosophy, religion, like community, everything is supposed to fulfill. So it's almost like it's separated from rationality almost in like a godlike kind of way.
Yeah. Here's where I would, because you've introduced it, I think it's legitimate for me to introduce this term. I want to use a religious term for this, even though I'm not, I don't consider myself belonging to any particular religion. I think that's a case of idolatry. And this is an idea, I get from Tillich, right? That what we're trying to do is make something that is not ultimate ontologically. We're trying to treat it and relate to it as if it is the ultimate, as if ultimacy, as you say, all of those deepest needs are going to be found, and the deepest reality is going to be found. I mean, I think this is pervasive in our culture in general. We can talk about this later, how we try to commodify everything. We get stuck in a modal confusion, and we try to make the having of things bear the burden of our of self-transcendence and development. So I think it's something that's pervasive in our culture, but it gets especially given prominence because like I said, it has its own genre attached to it. We idolize, and that's again degenerate because there's a big difference between an idol and an icon, right? An icon is a participatory symbol. I mean, so you can see traditions like the Tantric tradition in which the sexual relationship and we see even that doesn't work because when I say sexual and I don't use the word romantic, people think we're just talking about people having sex, right? But that's not what it is in Tantric. There's love, there's profound love, but the idea is the person is iconic. The relationship between you and the other person is a participatory symbol, right, of you getting into contact with a deeper reality. And that's a very different thing from thinking that the person is actually the source and cause of what you need in order to satisfy your longings for realness and meaning and depth and healing and growth and self-transcendence. So I think it's an idol in the sense that it's a perversion of a symbolic potential to us that could really afford mutual self-transcendence into having a person. All right. And they are going, and by having that person, it's almost like they're like a river flowing unto you that you're just going to drink from forever and finally be satisfied in your thirst for meaning. And so there's vampiric elements in it. And the problem is we used to have a symbol for that aspect of it, the vampire. But then we got this wonderful idea. Let's turn vampires into kind of a romantic story. Hey, isn't that a great idea? What we'll do is take vampires, which, are supposed to be, a real perennial problem with, romantic relationships is people come into it with this vampiric, I'm going to draw your lifeblood from you. That's the vampire. And then what we say is, no, here's a great idea. Let's make vampires romantic and sexy and put it all into a romantic story. And it's like, oh my gosh. Right? It's just like,
that's almost kind of like symbolic of the problems with romanticism.
Yes.
So I wanted to just clarify something. So I guess one of the biggest problems you have with Romanticism is that it's very irrational, and maybe where they went wrong with this is they are buying into Kant's notion of reality, which is that, well, rationality can't actually get us in contact with reality. And it sounds like you're espousing the idea that well, we should hold more of a realist view, that rationality can actually get us into contact with reality.
Yeah, I mean, but I don't think, I mean, so I agree with everything you said, Chris, but I would say that it's not just a criticism of his metaphysics, it's a criticism of his cognitive psychology. He has a particularly deeply Cartesian view of the mind that I think is fundamentally mistaken. But if you have that Cartesian view, then I think his epistemology is pretty much inevitable. And his and therefore his metaphysics. So I think what we have to do is get back, right, to pulling apart the sort of Cartesian view of the mind that he's working within. And I think that's part of the problem. So I think in addition to trying to reconnect reason and love, and you've got really important work being done by, really important philosophers like Frankfurt in his book Reasons for Love, right? And other people. Ronnie D'Souza's done work on love at the University of Toronto, for example. I think another thing we need to do is to take seriously what's going on in 4E cognitive science and basically say, no, the mind and body, we undercut that dualism, say no, mind and body are deeply interpenetrating and interdefining, and the mind, body, and the environment are coupled and co-determining, and so cognition is embodied, right? It's embedded, and we're not passive observers like Locke and Hume. The reason why Locke and Hume find the world so absurd is because their implicit observer is a static, passive observer. Well, if I just was static and passive, it's like being sort of trapped in Plato's cave. But that's not how my perception is designed to work. I'm supposed to be an active, interactive, moving perceiver. This is one of the things that's central in 4E cog science.
Yeah, self-transcendence.
Yeah, and moving around and living in act. So we need to adopt a psychology that is embodied, embedded, and inactive.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, listening to this has been like pretty uncomfortable because I'm just realizing how much I've like internalized this decadent romanticism and like this idea of like, yeah, like listening to you, I'm like, okay, yeah, it's bad, I get it, but the idea of like taking like a rational approach to like love and dating is my initial impulse when I hear that is like imagining myself as like almost like a Cartesian procedural decision maker, because I don't really want to be sitting there being like, okay, this person has these good qualities, these bad qualities. Maybe we can like elaborate a version of rationality that's not quite that.
And I didn't get to the fourth E, right? For one of the fourth E's in 4E cognitive science is emotion. The idea that emotion and reason are deeply interdependent. All of that. So that's why I'm trying to bring back this. Now it's an actual word, by the way, and it's even in Homo sapiens, and we mistranslate that. That's why I'm trying to bring back the adjective sapiential, because right, people when they hear rational, they hear calculation, and they hear Cartesian calculation, they hear computation. So because of Descartes, we think reason is computation, but that, of course, is not the Socratic or the Platonic notion of reason. And it's not the notion of reason that's emerging, I think, in 4E Cog Sci, that's coming out of the embodied phenomenological approach to cognitive science.
So that's the notion that essentially your emotions are telling you useful information and you should factor them into your decision in order to have the most rational decision possible.
Let's look at everything you just did. Okay? You were doing this. So there's embodiment. You're actually activating and making use of your hands and activating parts of your brain to exact them, to offload some of the processing that your working memory inferential machinery can't fully do. And you're also, now you're nodding when I'm doing that, and now what you're doing is you're trying to set up mind-site resonance, and this is stuff, that many people are talking about. It's why I'm doing all this work on the next series after Socrates and the importance of dialectic, how interpersonal reasoning and rationality is, and how communicative. So here's the embodiment, and you're nodding, and we're getting in the resonance, and the resonance is helping constrain what I'm going to say and what I'm going to pay attention to. And so there's a phenomenological aspect. I have to have my salience landscape being shaped, and we're co-shaping it in a cooperative fashion. And then what we're doing, right, in addition to the embodiment and that embeddedness and the enactment, there's emotion coming in. Because if, for example, if I start to become disinterested and I don't care, then what I pay attention to and what I consider, what inferences I'm going to draw and what conclusions I'm going to pursue and what questions are going to come up to me and stand out as salient, all of that's going to shift as my emotional framework shifting, right? Because if you bring in the notion that your cognition is inactive, that what you're doing is constantly evolving the sensory motor loop, then emotions are crucial. Because what they're constantly doing is they're giving you this sort of bidirectional feedback. They're giving you bidirectional feedback of what's your whole sort of state. They're like, okay, not just what's going on in my mind and not what's just going on in my body, not just introspection, not just interoception. Interoception is like, what's going on in my left toe? Like that's physiological, right? Introspection is what's going on in my mind. But emotions like are a stereoscopic fusion of introception and introspection. They're giving you quickly, okay, me, right? And then also what's important and relevant in this situation. And it's like a stereoscopic vision, putting them together the way like your left and right visual fields give you depth perceptions. And so they give you two things that you need. They give you a depth of connection, but they also limit what you're paying attention to. That's why Damasio's work shows if you take emotion out of people, they have all of their calculative machinery running on all of his case studies. Like their calculation machines are running perfectly, but when the emotions are removed, they can't function at all because they try to calculate everything. That's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about reason. I'm talking about all of this stuff we're doing, and instead of just letting it run, doing what we're doing, which is doing good science on it, and then figuring out, well, how can we improve? How can we put self-corrective machinery into all of what's happening here so that we reduce all of this, the way all of this behavior makes us prone to, self-deception?
So there's a whole bunch of different directions that I want to go with that. That's very, very, very fertile ground for discussion. One of them, and you can tell me which one you want to follow. One of them is so that kind of opens the door for sort of collective rationality, where we're all together in a group and we're all using embodiment, we're all using emotions, and so what we're doing is we're participating in this kind of rational problem solving process collectively. And the other thing is that implies that emotions are a kind of essential part of computation, and that if we were to make strong artificial intelligence, that it would actually need to be emotional in order to be as strong as possible.
So let me apply to both the first and the second points, because I think they're both excellent. I think, this is why I'm launching all this work and the series on After Socrates, because you see it on Rebel Wisdom. You see it in the work that Guy Senstock is doing. You see it, in the really insightful, and the exemplification that Jordan Hall is doing, right? So people are really trying to get back to collective intelligence, but that's what's going on in the dialogues. You see, one of the things that happens is we shifted from Platonic dialogue, which is always communitarian, to the Aristotelian treatise, which is monologic. And we shifted from the importance of insight being central, because although there is argumentation, and that is necessary to what Socrates is doing, insight and transformation are as important as inference. They're held together, the three. But when you shift to Aristotle, you get the monologue and the treatise, and inference and conclusion becoming that, right? That starts to take priority. Right. And then it increases. So we're trying to get back to the power of distributed cognition. And there's some emerging science around that. And some of it's terrifying. Because you've got scientists literally linking rat brains together to make a cognitive entity that can solve problems that individual rats can't solve.
Oh.
Wait, and does that work?
Wow.
Yes. That works.
Oh my God.
No. That's not scary enough. They've recently done an experiment where they've done direct brain links between human beings. It's very preliminary, but they got some results analogous. So
there's our future, yes.
Yeah.
We're turning, and the technology, like it often does, is leaping ahead of us. But you can see that at least parts of the internet are turning towards collective intelligence. But you guys have seen parts of my series. I'm making it right now in the current episodes. Intelligence is necessary, but not sufficient for rationality. In addition to collective intelligence, and I agree, we need to be getting all this psychotech that puts us back, embodies us back, embeds us back within collective intelligence, and we're enacting it together. And it has an argumentative component to it and stuff like that, right? But that's not enough. We need to get the psychotech that will transform the collective intelligence into collective rationality, into what you see it at work in the Socratic dialogues, where what's happening is you get the instantiation of the logos, but the logos isn't just running. The logos is directed towards this project of becoming wiser, getting a deep kind of reflective transformation. The challenge to, deep, profound insight and change is part of what's going on there.
Yeah, that's definitely really crucial. I'm like reaching for a segue into the next question, which is a little bit the opposite of that. We're going to go through a few different questions about like the state of modern romance and love and kind of what's going wrong a little bit. And then at the end, we'll have like a longer kind of more free flow period where we're hopefully going to dive more deeply into the nature of what this stuff actually is and build some solutions. So this is maybe a bit the opposite direction.
Sure.
Into some manner of foolishness that's happening in society. But we've talked about Romanticism a bit, but one thing we were sort of thinking about while preparing this episode is we also sort of see an opposed tendency, or a seemingly opposed tendency, where like sex and dating have been almost like de-romanticized, or like sapped of all romanticism and even like vulgarized. Like for example, we say like porn and casual sex and friends with benefit types of relationships. And so like what do we make of that tendency? Like how does it interact with some other stuff we've been talking about?
Great. I think that's a great question. So I think part of it is to remember there's an occluded but nevertheless powerful symbiotic relationship between Romanticism and calculative Cartesianism, right? They're shadows of each other. And so as people come to be overwhelmed by the failures of the decadent Romanticism, one tendency is to think, well, the only alternative way of understanding me and my endeavors to make meaning is Cartesian calculation. And so a calculative framework is going to seem like, well, that's the default strategy. The problem with that, of course, is, to really undertake that, is not something that most people are willing to undergo. Oh, underdo would be a neat new word. I got to think about that.
It kind of strikes me as kind of a similar phenomenon to postmodernism, where, we have modernism with all this art and beauty and, we should hold things up on a pedestal. And then we have the postmodern movement, which is like, no, let's tear all that down and let's be as vulgar as possible. Let's make anti-art. I'm just throwing that out there.
Well, but notice how that for all of its claim. So I think I wanted to say, first of all, so the turn to calculation comes in, but for exactly the reasons you articulate, Chris, I don't think it's a pure Cartesianism. I think it is still just more, it is enshrouding, and therefore there's pretense. It's deeply pretentious in that sense. It's enshrouding, right? The core of Romanticism, which is will and the making. And if I can't make meaning, then one thing I can do is I can make anti-meaning. I can will, and Joker, I can destroy, and what'll at least be left is the core, the now orphaned core of relevance realization, which is, as a bioeconomic thing, relevance realization is grounded in how things are relevant to you, right? Because you have to literally import them. Right? You have to be coupled to them. But of course, in development, we move beyond that kind of egocentric. But when all of that collapses, all that's left is this pure will, this will that cannot make any lasting impression on reality. And so what can it do? Well, what it can do is the following. It can will absurdity. And why is that a good thing to do? Because if I will absurdity, then I will make the world more and more like the absurdity that is at the heart of narcissism. And thereby my narcissism is legitimated. So that's why you see this weird amalgam, I would argue, of calculation and narcissism and this kind of violent aggressiveness towards meaning structures. The iconoclasm, if I want to put it that way, right? It looks like they shouldn't belong together, but I think for the argument I just gave you, they actually do really belong together very, very deeply. And the fact that in Joker, his romantic relationship is completely illusory, right? Oh, sorry, that's a spoiler. Jeez, I'm sorry. Oh, but the fact that it's so illusory, right, it is again, right? All that he can actually will is, and that's his big anti-insight, right? All that he can will is the absurdity that's within him. That's where that's the last conformity. Notice that's such a decadent, desperate form of conformity. Okay, I want to be in conformity with the world, the Platonic project has collapsed. Well, I'll try Romanticism, that collapses. So what's left? I will give in to the absurdity of narcissism, and I will the absurdity of the world, and then the world and I are finally, what we at least share, what we at least conform to, is a lack of form. And that's the last tenuous touch.
So I haven't seen the new Joker movie, and that's all right. I'm sure I'll still enjoy it. But I'm thinking of the reference from The Dark Knight, where with the other version of the Joker, where I guess it's the old guy, I forget his name, but
Heath Ledger.
Yeah, but the old wise guy, the British guy, Q or
Alfred.
Alfred, yeah, exactly. Where he says some men just want to watch the world burn, and it seems like what you just said and you just laid out is an explanation for that. It's like, well, maybe society around me is there's no way that I can really make sense of it, but I do have this will, and with my will I can destroy what's out there, and by doing that I can I don't know, participate in will to power or whatever.
You get legitimation in the sense that at last the inner world and the outer worlds are back in consonance in their absolute lack of consonance. And the thing is, Fromm predicted that. He predicted that as we fall deeper and deeper into modal confusion, and as we more and more desperately try to satisfy our being needs through the having mode, we will more and more we will move more and more, and he predicted this in the 70s, we will more and more move towards violence. As that frustration, and the deep hunger go more and more unsatisfied, he said, we will move towards, like, the last vestiges that I'm trying to articulate here will be violent destructiveness.
So I see a lot of this actually from a different angle. Like when we talk about casual sex and friends with benefits relationships, I think for some people it is kind of destructive. Like, I've just given up on romance, so I'm going to say whatever, I'll just have meaningless whatever. But I think for a lot of people, it's kind of a move towards rationality, or at least an attempt towards a move towards rationality. It's saying something like, I'm young and I don't want to try to aim for this romantic notion, and I don't necessarily even believe in it. And committing to a long-term partner right now doesn't make sense in my life, but I still want things like affection, sexual pleasure. We can still have a relationship that's going to be mutually beneficial, even if it's not committed. Mm-hmm. Do you see that trend as, like, maybe it could be positive, or do you think that that's disconnecting us even more somehow?
So I think that's a fair point. But I was responding to the characterization Chris had given things. Let's take a look at the aspect that you've brought out, because I think it's important. So yes, I do think now and I talk to a lot of people on this. I don't have systematic scientific research on this. All I have is anecdotal, but I am interested in this question. So I talk to many people who are taking this up. And so there's one group I'd say doesn't fall into your characterization, because they're clearly being calculative, and it's calculation in the service of narcissism. So I think that's an overlap group between the group I was just talking about and the group you're talking. But then there is this group that seems to be, like you said, it's like, I don't believe the romanticism bullshit. I want some kind of connections. And so far, I want to answer this question carefully, because my job is not to be the grandfather of society, right?
Right.
I'm not right? And so in terms of my moral stance on this, and that is not irrelevant, I think if people enter into they can enter into whatever arrangements they want as long as they commit to communication and honesty, and there's clarity about what's going to be, as long, if we're trying to bring some kind of rationality into this and we're trying to be deceptive and self-deceptive, then we're just being hypocrites, right? So we've got to really try to reduce the deception, and these two feed on each other, the deception and the self-deception, as much as we can. Now that again shaves off another part of your, of the group you're talking about, because I also meet a lot of people, well, they're not being calculative and narcissistic. They're being, for lack of a better word, they're being very self-deceptive is because they can go into this with a kind of naivete. Like, we don't really have to talk too much about this. We just know and blah, and all this kind of stuff. It's like, no way. Right. And so that brings me to, sort of, I guess, and again, please understand this is intended as helpful advice, not as moral censure. Right. It's like, well, okay, if you agree with you want to, reduce deception and self-deception in these kinds of more casual relationships, you have to understand meaning making a lot better than most of you do. Things like the tantric tradition, right? It's like, no, sex affects you in lots of profound ways and triggers attachment issues. And, and you have to have incredible self-awareness to manage that well without it overwhelming you. And it rewires your brain. It has to. It has a Darwinian function, right? And so I'm not saying that what you're proposing is impossible. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is it's a lot more challenging and difficult and requires a lot more self-knowledge and a lot more scientific education before I think it's feasible for people. That's what I would say to that.
That makes sense, and it's probably the exact wrong group who would want to undertake that, because it's mostly like young people who would be in this phase where they would want to be able to explore and be free and stuff like that. People with the least amount of experience.
Yeah, and so I see this happening. I see, this is just hookup culture, and then the person is, but that. He's seeing somebody else, and it's all like, all that machinery isn't just going to go away because listen to my language, you're trying to will it to go away. That's not going to be enough. Just willing it to go away. Is it carved in stone? I'm not saying that either, but I'm saying it's insufficient to just will that those things, that all of that ancient primordial machinery, intrapsychically and interpersonally, right, and intraculturally is not going to be triggered, because of course it's going to be triggered, and it's just putting your will against it. That's massively insufficient.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like listening to this, like it almost is just, I think maybe not for everybody, but for a lot of people, is almost like just like a different reshuffling of like this Cartesian, romantic, nihilistic kind of mess. Like you have like just a valorization of like a different internal feeling. Like, okay, it's not my romantic love, but it's my base desires. Those are the ones that are like super important. And then this act of will, and then like this nihilistic destruction of all these things that have historically been important. I don't know. It doesn't seem that different to me, I guess.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's a lot of that. I mean, there might be a potential for something, and I was taking what Katie said seriously, because I don't have an argument that completely forecloses against it. But I agree with what you're saying. In the constant shuffling, I think overlaps with another issue that concerns me. And this is the one I got to sort of calm myself here, because it's one that tends to get me very sort of visceral. And I keep saying this: we have to stop trying to demonize or deify particular faculties or parts of the psyche. Like, it's my reason that will like in the Cartesian sense, that will take me to truth and certainty. No. It's my intuition. No. It's my emotions. No. It's my gut. No. It's my base desires. No. Like, there is no aspect of you that has that power. Neither is there no aspect of you that you can afford to demonize and do without. These attempts to deify and demonize our psyche in order to try and solve this problem, we've got to stop doing that. That is a radical misframing of the problem.
So I want to just bring up maybe an idea, and I want to see what you guys think about it. So the idea that we were talking about before, where romanticism is causing us to pedestalize, romantic love. It's making finding the partner and, the purpose of your life. And it's making the partner themselves, when you find them, the kind of fulfillment of all of your spiritual needs. It seems to me that this is actually a very useful way of enforcing monogamy. Jordan Peterson was recently in a big controversy talking about how, we live in this society of enforced monogamy. It does seem like that mythology relating to romance is actually helpful with enforcing that. And it seems to me, and it seems to me that there's a kind of move towards like polyamory. I don't know if you've heard about that, but it seems to me that maybe it's irrational, but maybe it's rational. Maybe it has some kind of purpose. I don't know. Maybe things are changing, and so I just wanted to see what you guys thought about that.
Well, I would say I think that's again evidence that Romanticism tried to take over the role of religion, because religion had previously been the enforcer of monogamy. And there were sort of deeply sort of historical functional reasons for trying to do that, all right, in terms of connecting kinship structures, connecting kinship structures. This is an argument from Levi-Strauss. So one of the points of, marriage and monogamy are to take otherwise isolated kinship groups and then bind them together. And if you want to bind them together long term, you then have to make the marriages lifelong. You also want to provide stability, because for a long time there's no state support for the upbringing of children. You want to reduce the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. Like, there's all these deep functionalities. So it wasn't just like crazy people, right? So I think that it became deeply ingrained. Now, whether or not that is still needed, that's something we can talk about. But I think what I'm saying is I see Romanticism, when religion starts to lose its ability to enforce monogamy. Romanticism, this is another way in which it tries to step into the breach and fulfill the role that Christianity used to perform. So I agree with that. Yeah, I think what people are doing now, because most of those reasons I just articulated, the functional needs for monogamy, the structuring of kinship systems, childcare. Now, one of the big differences, by the way, is people still think it's important to consider monogamy if they're going to have kids. So that functionality still exists, right? That still exists. And then, the controls on sexually transmitted disease, we've come up with more scientific interventions on that. So a lot of I think what's dawned on people, not only personally with the failures of marriage, is that, right, and because both the religion and Romanticism are no longer there, sort of pressuring people into this, I think people are considering alternatives. Again, my concern, I've experimented with something like that in my life much earlier, and I'm not going to talk about it in any detail. And also I've talked to people. Yeah. Exactly the right tone. And what I've seen of some of the research is, and again, this overlaps with Katie's point a bit, because maybe we don't want this, but it's difficult for polyamorous things to achieve a long-term stability. I'm not denying that it's possible, but there's also long-term stability is possible for monogamy. So we're comparing probabilities here. So let's play in a fair playing field. Am I denying that the polyamorous structures can sort of achieve a kind of stability for people? No, I'm not denying it. But I think the probability is really low, because I think all the reasons that make monogamy hard are exacerbated and accelerated in polyamorous relationships. And I don't know if we have any I don't know if we have any good science on this, and I certainly don't think we have any good cultural psychotech for trying to. Now, a reply to be might be, well, I'm not after stability. That's a harder one to understand. I can understand that at sort of earlier stages in your life, you might not want stability, but people, it seems the research is pretty clear that people eventually need more stability so they can, you need stability to pursue long-term developmental goals, right? And if you want your relationships, as I think you should, to be things that are, affording and contributing to your long-term developmental goals, stability, a kind of stability is needed. So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say it's tough. I've some experience with this too that I won't go too deep into, but it's tough because if you are in an open relationship structure, if you're in that kind of a a non-monogamous structure, then you're introducing the possibility of falling in love and new relationship energy, which is like this extremely tumultuous, like slap you in the face kind of hormonal insane experience into your life, like potentially forever. Whereas in a monogamous structure, that's something that just happens once and then it's over and then you move on. But
you don't want an echo chamber of infatuation. That sounds like a bad idea. You also don't want, there's the potential for that sort of developmental progression you talked about to get out of sync. So, this one's moving into, a deep friendship, kind of a romantic relationship. And then this one, for whatever reason, circumstantial, is suddenly sparking up into infatuation. And then, I won't compare them. Bullshit. You'll compare them. You're a human being. You're a primate. You're gonna compare them. And somebody's gonna suffer and something is gonna suffer in that comparison. And so there's all it's like a complex system. As systems get more and more complex, the internal environment of the system becomes as problematic as the environment they're trying to solve. And, but on the other side, just because I don't want to come off like a Victorian prude, right? It seems like for evolutionary reasons, we're sort of wired for like a 10-year thing, like for about 10 years, which is about, for Homo erectus, that's enough time to bring the young into viability. And then we're supposed to move on. And so, I think that means there is a bit of an uphill battle in any relationship, any monogamous relationship past 10 years. I don't know if it's the 7-year itch or the 10-year doldrums or whatever we want to call it. But, I think that's a real thing. And
you mentioned Homo erectus. Does that also apply to Homo sapiens, I assume?
I think so. I think there's evidence. Sorry, I don't want to sound like, we've piled up, we've got warehouses of evidence or something like that. It's very underdetermined. But there's some evidence that there's probably something more long-term going on, because of the needed childcare. Like, for example, human beings, we live long enough that grandfathers and grandmothers exist. This is, the grandmother hypothesis. That wouldn't make any sense if the pair wasn't staying together, kind of thing, right? And so, and that is definitely an evolutionary advantage, right? And then you get sort of post-sexual people who can bring a lot of wisdom to bear on the still sexual relationship and also offload some of the child care of the children. So,
well, I would say,
go ahead.
The grandmother, wouldn't the grandmother make sense if the tribe stayed together?
The tribe stayed together, but it'd be good if you had two grandmothers, right? Not just one. So if the couple at least stay in some good relationship to each other, I'm very hesitant, as you can tell, to talk about this because now the evidence is getting really thin, and I feel like I'm starting to I'm just doing a kind of unjustified speculation. That's why I'm waving my hands a lot.
No worries. Maybe we could pull another factor into this. One thing that we've noticed or been talking about a bit is kind of the politicization of love, like with feminism, and then the counter swing to that, like the manosphere, and then also it seems like
what was
being
the word
monogamous.
you used? What was the word you used?
The manosphere.
The manosphere. Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so that applies. That applies to all the men's rights people and the incels and
anti-feminism, the red pill,
men going their own way. Yeah,
MGTOW. Yeah.
Pickup art. Yeah, the whole deal. Yeah, it seems like non-monogamy versus monogamy in some ways it's kind of like a political alignment or political statement. How do you see those trends coming into it?
So that's a really complex thing. And my one overarching concern is I'm not accusing any of us here. We're discussing this. But people often give very simplistic sort of positions on this and accounts of this. First of all, I think this needs to be stated because I think there are real issues that have needed to be addressed. And so I think one of the reasons why a lot of these, especially feminism arose is because there are real problems that had to be addressed. Now that's, if you allow me, that doesn't mean I agree with or just, that justifies every statement made by every feminist theorist. That's ridiculous, I think. I think the reason why you see some of these men's movements arising too is that there's a problem that our society is somehow not addressing. I'm not saying that these movements are the solution, but we have to pay attention to they're often portrayed as people are just being cranky or resentful, or they just want, I think that's an unfair attribution to many of the people that get involved with this. Are people self-serving at times? Do they have a grudge? Do they have an axe to grind? Of course people do. Humans are sort of, I think the distribution of shittiness is pretty Gaussian. But are there legitimate problems? Yes. And so, one of the things, it's like speaking the name of Voldemort for me. I get compared to him so often. But I mean, one of the things that is important about Jordan Peterson, and I want to.
I already broke that particular ice, so you're fine.
Okay. Well, the thing is, I mean, again, and my attitude to, I'm sort of very much in disagreement with a lot of Jordan's political positions, but I have much more sympathy for I think there's two pillars upon which he stands. One is, he represents a particular political stance that I disagree with. The other, I think, is he put his finger on the meaning crisis, and he set himself up as the father figure of the meaning crisis. And what's important about that is whether, independent of what you think about the content of what he's saying, the fact that, and it's an important fact to get very carefully, his demographic, right, is huge, and it's so specific. It's almost largely young white males, right? And it's what's happening, right? What's going on such that group is so attracted to him. Now, part of it, I think, is the meaning crisis, but the meaning crisis tends to be much more diverse in the audience it seems to be attracting, if that's the right word. And so it's what's going on here? So what I'm saying is we need to step back, and before we rush into an ideological framing of all of these movements that we're discussing, I would like it, because I think we're often, is there, again, are people doing shitty stuff with all of this? Yes, they are. And I don't want to deny that. I do not want to deny that. But I also don't want, the signal noise, the signal detection problem. I don't want to ignore the information that's diagnostic, that's pointing to real issues and real problems that are behind this politicization that I think we need to try and get a clearer picture on and try and address. And the thing is, we're politicizing everything, which is really weird, right? Because we're politicizing everything where at the same time that worldwide, there's blips, but worldwide there is a very steady, trend of disenfranchisement. People not voting, people not joining political parties, people not donating, all that kind of stuff happening. And so again, you have to put those two things together. Why is everything being politicized while the political arena is becoming disenfranchised? Many people think it is irredeemably corrupt and bankrupt. And so that's a telling thing. We've got to sit down and think about that much more carefully.
Yeah, definitely agreed. I'm glad that we were able to sit down and have a long form conversation so we could touch on all of the nuance.
Yeah, I really thank you for that, because this is kind of like what I'm talking about. It's not quite, because there's a bit of an interview aspect to this, but there is an aspect of distributed cognition here and dialogos going on, and I think you're right, Chris. That needs a long form for it. It needs a long form. I don't want to be seen as copping out on your question, Katie.
No, I understand. I don't see it as a cop out. It's a dicey topic, and I think what you're bringing up is important. Is before we try to, rather than placing any judgment on particular people for believing in certain things or getting drawn into certain ideologies that we may or may not agree with, you're absolutely right that I think that the rise of what I call the manosphere is pointing to something real, and it shouldn't just be dismissed because people might not agree with it or think that they're or think that these people are bigots or something like that.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like a lot of these movements, it's like you said, they're kind of doing a lot of different things. Like for some people, they do seem to be a vehicle for like acting out or like just something they really need to express very strongly in the present. But it also seems like a lot of them are almost, maybe at their more articulated level, it's almost like there's like a battle over like what the future is going to be. In this domain we're talking about, which is like love and dating. Like there's some people who are like battling to preserve a more traditional responsibility-based, like monogamous structure. Or there's some people who are like fighting for a future where like all boundaries are transgressed. And there's some people who are fighting for almost a battle between like some people who are fighting for like women to have a bit more power in the future and some people who are fighting for men to have a bit more power. And it's like, there's some ways that that's zero sum or maybe perceived as zero sum. And there's like, it seems like a battle over the future to me.
I agree. I think that's right. I think there's, and I'm using this term broadly, but I think there's a utopic aspect to a lot of this. That if a utopic aspect that often carries with it, which many utopias have, the idea that the future has to, in order for the future to be realized, it has to be fought for. And this, of course, we've inherited this from the revolutions, right? The way you bring about the utopia is through fighting, because the fighting brings about the revolution, and the revolution brings about the utopia. So I think that's very much the case. So one of the things I'm working on with Peter Lindbergh and with Guy Senstock and with Jordan Hall and Christopher Mastropietro and with the people at Rebel Wisdom and is, can we get to a place that what I often call a cultural cognitive grammar that used to undergird our political projects towards the future, which is what I often typify as opponent processing rather than adversarial processing. Because it used to be that we had a commitment to the process as self-correcting that was held to be superordinate and therefore constraining on our commitment to our particular party. I'll just use that very broadly to mean whatever group we're belonging to. And that is completely broken down. That is completely broken down. Now, what you used to have, instead of the adversarial, winner take all, crush, it's a zero-sum game, it's very limited and scarce resources, and I have to get as much of it as I can before it disappears. And part of that, I think, is because we have the looming echo crisis in the background sort of impregnating our consciousness about all of this. What that scarcity mentality does is it leads to what we have now, which is people now, right, they commit to the party and its product at the expense of the process in which we're supposed to all have, to which we're all supposed to have a superordinate allegiance. Because if you see how intelligence works, how cognition works, it doesn't work in terms of adversarial processing. Like your limbic system doesn't try to kill your cortex. I'll kill it and defeat it and I'll get all the brain space. What they do is they're in opponent relationships. They pursue opponent goals, but they have checks and balances, and they're governed by an overarching organic normativity, if you'll allow me that adjective, in which the process of self-organization has to be kept going, right? And if the individual components, aren't contributing to that, then they are constrained and down-regulated. And so the fact that, and this is for both parties, so I'm not trying to be partisan here, the fact that like Republicans and Democrats are more fearful of the other party than they are of non-American threats to the country is like, whoa, that's really bad. Because if you can't set up opponent processing, then the system is in no way self-corrective. It is becoming purely self-destructive. And so what I want to try to do, this sounds hubristic and pretentious, right? But what I'm trying to do with all these people is, like I said, is if we can create sapiential distributed cognition in dialectic, can we bring back the self-corrective machinery of argumentative opponent processing that could then undergird, I should say, a new way of which we try to do our politics. If we could really change the cultural cognitive grammar of how we converse in a deep sense, then could that help us get out of this bind? That's part of what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do it.
That's great that you bring that up, because that's one of our main goals as well.
Yes.
Like is if we can solve the problem of distributed cognition, as you said, and having conversations where the outcome of the conversation is greater than the sum of all of the parts of the conversation.
Well said.
Then I think we have a bright future. But if we can't figure that out, then we're going to be struggling in the desert for a long time.
That's the logos and dialogos, right? The logos is a self-organizing. It's the root of our word logic, but it's right. But it also goes back to something deeper. It's there's a self-organization that takes place. So things come to belong together and fit together in a fashion of evolving intelligibility. Dialogos, by way of the logos. That's what we're trying to get back. That's what we need to get back to. But not in a nostalgic sense. We need to understand the ancient template and then integrate it with these current practices, communities of practices like circling, the insight dialogue, the anti-debate, etc. That's what I'm doing right now.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, that's really awesome. I mean, one part of it that's really scary to me is I think a big part of the problem is that a lot of people don't believe that human beings are rational and that this kind of dialogue is possible across disagreement. And
yeah,
and like I've met a lot of people, like it's like this Foucauldian idea that I guess the idea now is it's more prevalent on the left, which it probably just either a particularity of our particular moment or else not even accurate. But I definitely do see people who don't view rational dialogue with the other side as a viable tactic.
Yeah. So I mean, there's two components to that. One is the view that human beings aren't rational. And that's again, I mean, and I'm going to keep hammering on that. That's another shadow of decadent romanticism, because you're not naturally rational the way you're naturally intelligent. Rationality is something that you have to aspire to and cultivate, but it is very doable. It is realizable. It is something you can get better at. And I think I think the science on that is pretty supportive of what I'm saying. So, and I think Foucault was himself coming around to that, because towards the end of the career, when he's talking about technologies of the self, and he's getting really interested in Stoicism and the work of Hadot, and Hadot is the great spokesperson of ancient philosophy, Foucault is coming, I think he's trying to get back and come up with, again, this other notion of rationality, what I'm calling the sapiential view of rationality. You can see that in the later Foucault. The problem with Foucault, people who read Foucault, is they don't read him enough, and they don't read him to the end. Right? Follow the guy. If you're going to follow him.
So it seems to me that there are two kind of opposing problems to what RAL brought up, which is that on the one hand, there are people who seem to, when you bring them into a rational conversation, they ruin it for everybody else, basically, because they're just playing power games, and they're not. They're trying to take all of the resources for themselves, right? Because they have that scarcity mindset. And on the other hand, you have as you study and talk about how wisdom can be cultivated, and it's this, and anybody can do this, even people who maybe start out with not very much and don't have a high IQ or something like that. Like anybody can cultivate wisdom by just following some kind of hopefully whatever the opposite of parasitic processing is. This religion that's not a religion.
Yeah, and an ecology of practices.
An ecology of practices, yeah, exactly, or ennobling truths or something like that.
I mean, for me, like the central problem isn't that there's some people who are like, oh, there's this rational dialogue and I'm going to undermine it by playing these dirty tricks. Like the problem is there's people who don't believe that the rational dialogue even exists, who believe the rational dialogue is itself a power game.
Yeah. And that's part of the Foucault thing. But that's why I was, like I said, Foucault is turning at the end back to ancient Philia Sophia. I use the word Philia Sophia as to point back to the ancient practice of philosophy as a way of life, to use Hadot's term, rather than philosophy, which is the academic thing we have now. I think philosophy is good, by the way. I'm not dissing it, but I want to keep it distinct from Philia Sophia, right? And that's what you see Foucault turning towards, and increasingly so towards the end. And I think there's a reason for that, because I think he was becoming aware that in addition to knowledge and power, I mean, I'm hesitating here because, Foucault's a titanic figure, and I'm not claiming to be a Foucault expert, but I think he was becoming aware, in addition to knowledge and power, and there's a way in which knowledge and power come together. There's meaning. in the sense that we're talking about here. And that needs to be brought into the relationship with knowledge and power. I think, if you'll allow me that conjecture, because that's what it is about Foucault, I think that bespeaks that we could bring people back to the table by getting them to realize that the discourse it can be, and maybe it will always have some dimension to it, but it doesn't have to, it's not exclusively about power. Human beings care about meaning as something distinct from the way they care about power. And in fact, what you see in things like Stoicism, and this is precisely why I think Foucault was interested in it, right, is people taking up a practice, a philosophia that is both intrapersonal and interpersonal of Stoicism that says the pursuit of power, fame, wealth, because that's a trilogy, is going to be put aside because I am pursuing the most meaningful life possible through the cultivation of wisdom. That's what Stoicism is explicitly about. And it's saying, and this is really possible. And you can really have Marcus Aurelius that can be the Roman emperor and be a great Stoic philosopher at the same time. There's, proof of concept. I think this is why Foucault was getting interested in things like Stoicism and the technologies of the self, because I'm surmising, people will disagree with me, I get that, but I think part of what's going on there is a dawning insight that people will forego the pursuit of power, and other material possession goals, in order to get enhanced meaning. And this is something that religion has traded on for a very long time. It's like I say, it's why the most reliable thing is why people have kids. Kids just undermine your longevity, your mental and physical health. They put a strain on your romantic relationships. Your finances are crushed. Your subjective well-being. You're filled with anxiety. You're prone to depression and mental fatigue. You start screwing up in your friendships and your work. And why do you do all this devastation? Because it makes your life more meaningful.
I'm really glad that you brought up raising kids, because one of the things that really strikes me in your Meaning Crisis series is the central role that you say that agape love plays in
Right. Yep.
in Christianity, but also there's something deeper that I guess the followers of the way were onto, where by becoming a parent, or you can do this with anybody, not just your kids, but you can basically just sacrifice yourself and give of yourself. And what this does is it actually creates meaning. Just wanted to tie that into what you were saying about meaning versus power.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you say, although I don't like to, and I don't think you're doing this. If you are, then challenge me. But I don't like to reduce or identify agapic love with just sacrificial love. Sacrifice, there's an element of sacrifice in it. And of course, Christianity built a lot around that. But you have to sacrifice, I'll paraphrase it, what Aristotle said about anger. You have to sacrifice in the right way for the right reason at the right time towards the right ends. So I think when the sacrifice is towards the conditions of meaning making that then in turn make meaning makers, because that's what you're trying to make when you're making a person. You have to make the conditions of meaning making that then germinate in and come to fruition in a being that is a meaning maker for itself, which is a person. I think that's towards which the sacrifice is appropriate. I mean, I think agape, or I think something similar in Buddhism, like karuna, compassion. Yeah, I think, and I'm going to argue this, I've been arguing this, I'm going to argue more in this series, that I think agape is something we need to talk more about. It's tended to be eclipsed by romantic love, in which eros has even eclipsed philia within the romantic relationships. We need to talk about the three kinds of love more extensively, and we need to see that agape does something for us. First of all, it makes persons, and that's just an amazing thing. But secondly, I think agape gives us a way of, I argue, addressing Susan Wolf's dilemma in her book, Meaning in Life and Why It Matters. She argues that what's at the heart of meaning in life is the desire to be, we have these metaphors of being connected to something larger than ourselves, which is about overcoming the egocentrism, and I get that. But that just sort of raises a question, but towards what end? And she says, well, what's going on there is, you're trying to get what she calls subjective attraction, meaning objective attractiveness. You want to be attracted to something that has a value independent of you valuing it. And then the problem is we have a worldview in which there's no objective value. So then we're stuck. When we need to have meaning in life because it's just foundational to our cognition and our agency. But we have a metaphysical worldview. This is, of course, part of the meaning crisis. You might say I'm somewhat obsessed with this topic. As part of the meaning crisis is we have a worldview that does not in any way legitimate that. And then I was saying, well, I don't think we need objectivity. I think we need the transjectivity, the real relation, the real coupling to the real conditions in which real meaning making is really possible. And that's what Agape is. And so I think Agape says, no, I don't have to be coupled to something that's objectively valuable. I have to be transjectively connected to those objective conditions to make those things that are constituted are constitutively valuable for me. Because if my meaning-making machinery, if my relevance realization machinery is not inherently interested in relevance realization, in meaning-making, then it loses all of its self-organizational capacity to be self-correcting. And if it's not self-organizing in a self-correcting manner, it's not developmentally functional. It's not functioning anymore. It is structurally, functionally organized to have to be invested in the meaning-making process. So persons, and I mean, I think you might maybe be able to make a case for this is what I think maybe might ground something like the notion of human rights separate from the Kantian way of justifying that. That's another topic, perhaps. But so in Agape, we find that real connection, that real relation to the real conditions by which persons are realizable, inherently valuable, because that's relevant realization finds itself inherently valuable because it has to, or it doesn't exist. Does that give it any kind of metaphysical necessity? No, it's a constitutive necessity. But constitutive necessities are fine. That I don't think we need God. I don't mean any insult to theists, but that God has written it in this thing here is, objectively valuable. I don't think we need that. I think Agape, man, this sounds like a homework card, right? But I think Agape is the answer to Wolf's problem. Right? It's the answer to that. How do we get, how do we address the issue of meaning in life without a metaphysics of objective value?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, this is really interesting and I think could potentially provide some foundation for maybe getting at how we could approach romance and dating in a more healthy way. Before we get to that, which is what our second half is going to be about, I can also kind of see how this, again, flipping it back to foolishness, how this modal confusion between the having and the being mode and the also like maybe the search for like an objective value that I could see how it can connect to like online dating and like Tinder and stuff like that. And so maybe do you want to speak to that?
Yeah. I think those two are connected in the way you've drawn them together. So the idea, just quickly, in case people aren't aware of it, modal confusion is it's an idea from Fromm, but it ultimately I think goes back to the Stoics, that we have different sets of needs. We have having needs, and these are the needs that are met by consume. I mean, you see me drinking water. I have to have water. I have to consume it. I have to control it. I have to secure it. There has to be security around it, right? If there's insecurity around water, as a biological organism, I'm going to become non-viable, and I generally consider that bad, and things like that. And so that comes with it. In order to satisfy those goals, there's a particular cognitive framing, right, that comes into play to help me solve those problems. So I understand things very categorically, because if I can categorize an object, right, this is a cup, then I know how to manipulate and control it. I know how to replace it if it's damaged, right. I have that relationship to things. I find lack of knowledge aversive. So I don't want to, I have curiosity to try and fill in my knowledge gaps, but I don't want to prolong curiosity. That gets very aversive and, and taxing. And so you got that sort of whole constellation of things, because what it's designed to do is to get you to find the information you need, categorize it effectively, manipulate the objects efficiently so you can solve the problem at hand of securing the things that need to be secured and controlled and consumed in order to meet your having needs. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. There's no sort of moral injunction against that, because if you don't have that, you're not here. You're not here, and you need to spend a lot of your day in the having mode, or you're dead. Right? And you're at least an irresponsible burden to those around you. So again, you don't want to deny the having mode, or okay, I'll just leave it at that. The contrast is the being mode. This is the need that is met. These are developmental needs. These are needs that are met by becoming something. Becoming someone rather than having and controlling. So you have to go through development. So these are our needs to be virtuous, to be honest, to be mature, to be rational, I would argue, things like that. And they involve aspiration.
Does that involve wonder also?
Yeah.
Versus curiosity?
Yes, exactly. And that's why you're happy to prolong wonder. In contrast, you're happy to prolong wonder into awe. I mean, that's for me one of the fundamental differences between Aristotle and Plato. Socrates says, philosophy begins in wonder, and Aristotle understands that as curiosity that should be resolved by the monologic treatise that fills in all the gaps. And that's why he's the great universal genius and systematizer. Plato says, no, what you want to do, right, is I'm trying to get you to aspire and to self-transcend. So you want to turn the wonder, you want to deepen it into awe, right? That is constantly opening you up and putting you into an ongoing trajectory, a developmental trajectory of self-transcendence. And that's the fundamental difference. That's why people they want wonder to keep going. And they're happy if it can deepen into awe. A lot of religion is about just provoking that, for people. So yeah, that the being mode is the mode of wonder, because what wonder does is it's not trying to solve a problem. It's trying to get you introduced to mystery. What does that mean? It means it's trying to get you to call the framing of reality and the framing of yourself into question. You're moving outside of the categorizations because you're not trying to solve a problem. You're confronting a mystery because you're trying to call into question so that you can put it into developmental motion, all of this framing that you just take for granted when you're in the having mode, because that's how you're going to grow these things that you need to grow in order to satisfy your developmental needs. And so you have an I-thou relationship to things. You don't have a categorical relationship. You're pursuing wonder. You're pursuing mystery. And Fromm says you're not using intelligence in problem solving. You're using reason, because as we've been talking about it in the sapiential sense, reason is about the cultivation, the aspiration towards wisdom.
So do you think that online dating is a reflection, like a cause or maybe an effect of modal confusion, where people are pursuing romantic relationships only with the I-it having mode?
Yeah. That's exactly, there's two kinds of modal confusion. One kind of modal confusion is to pursue having needs within the being mode. And these are people that are sort of too heavenly minded to be any earthly good. Right. And they're off all, and we have sort of mythology around that, like sort of Peter Pan and never confronts his shadow and never grows up and, just always playing. Right. That sort of stuff. And then but that isn't the prevalent thing that Fromm was concerned with. He thought there are more prevalent form of modal confusion. And this is how the Marxism had a deep influence on him, is he thought that market forces really emphasize getting us to misframe our being needs as having needs, so that we try to solve being needs within the having mode. So, as you said, we need to be in love. That is such a great phrase. First of all, we need to be, not have, and it's something we participate in. It's not something we will. It's not something we just empirically have impressed upon us in some Lockean fashion. We have to participate in it. Right? We have to be coupled in the right way. We have to be active, but also receptive. It has to be self-organizing. It has to take on a life of its own. We have to be in love, right? But what we could do is we can have lots of sex, because, right? Or we want to become mature so we can have a house, right? Again, a house, a dwelling is a completely legitimate having mode thing. But many people, are often, you can see this, the whole suburban fetishization of the house is clearly not about, let's get people well sheltered. It's about, now I have achieved maturity and status because I have this house. And of course, it doesn't work because you don't actually become mature by having. And so what do? Well, I must need a bigger house. That's clearly the problem. I don't have enough houseness. And you get suburban sprawl and all that kind of stuff. So I think we can having a device that like just inframes people the way this thing does, and if you're on Tinder or something like that, right, it can really lead to modal confusion, because you can start, especially if you've grown up like you guys have, right, in the advent of social media, where relationship is confused with likes and with numbers of followers that you have, right? So you can all of this can really inframe you and thereby misframe you in that I need to have, and I gotta possess, and like think of that action. I understand it's but even the action, like, it's a gesture that fuses together selection and dismissal. And that's such a having mode way of being, right? It's deep modal confusion. Now, I want to be really clear. I think there are good ways in which things like online dating can be used. I met my current partner, and she is like titanically the best person I've ever been with through online dating, because one of the things you can do. Sorry, this sounds self-congratulatory, but I have no other way other than speaking it from first person, because going into other people's dating with what I saw, it's a cesspool. When you start online dating, it's like you're in the sewers, because you just get a wash in, sort of pornographic things, not just sexual, but people want to sell you and manipulate you and scam you, and right, or they're lying and they're vampiric, and there's all of that, right? And so you wait, and it's really depressing. But then what happened is, is I said, well, I'm a cognitive scientist. What I could do is I could engineer some psychotech and, bring some rationality to this and try to figure out the patterns and try to figure out the profiling. And so I started experimenting with it in almost a scientific sense. And then what happened is, right, I started meeting good people. Mm-hmm. I started meeting good people. But the format doesn't do that on its own. You can't just, right, but you had to work with it, for lack of a better word. So I'm not trying to say that they have to put you into having mode, but they have a strong tendency to do so and thereby cause modal confusion.
Yeah, that makes sense. It kind of something you said about Fromm and how he felt that the market caused people to tend to be more in the having mode, I think is a lot like what's going on with online dating. I agree with you. I don't think that online dating is going to make you be in the having mode with relationships, but maybe it lends itself that way, especially with something like Tinder.
Yeah.
In a very market type way, it makes, people have always talked about dating as a market, but online dating really makes dating a market. Like you're browsing and you're comparing people, and you can go out on a lot of dates. There's a ton of choice, like in a market, and you can almost kind of try to gauge your value and like, what's the best that I can get. It's really easy to get into that. Yeah.
Fromm called it the market personality, and how we commodify ourselves to get the best package that we can trade within the market. Yeah. He called it the market personality, in fact. And it's like, and people even use language like, I'm going to try and trade up. Like, I hear people saying that, and it's sort of like, oh, I guess I'm old enough. And maybe I'm being insensitive to the generational difference. But yeah, it's like when people say, well, I think I can trade up. It's like, whoa, what is that? Like, wow.
Yeah, that's icky.
Icky of like sexual market value.
Yeah. Like, I think I can trade up, right? It's like, wow.
Yeah. It's very harsh. It takes all the humanity out of it.
Well, it's dehumanizing. It's dehumanizing, and that's one of the most telling markers of modal confusion is dehumanization, because the being mode is all about the opposite, about trying to get into that developmental project of meaning making and humanity making and person making.
Do you have any tips for how to better utilize these online dating tools, John?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if they're still relevant. I mean, one of the things I did was I started to step back and look at all the things that had gone wrong, and I started to try and find, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to generalize, because it might be that my particular, whatever it is, profile attracts a particular set of people that were problematic, and you might have a different set of problematic people. So take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. So I'll try to keep it sort of abstract for that reason. I stepped back and I sort of looked at, all the failed things, and I was trying to look for markers across all these instances that were not ones that I initially found salient, that I was sort of considering when I was looking for a partner, but nevertheless were tracking across all these instances and were therefore potentially predictive of people who were going to be sort of problematic. And I'm trying to use a very neutral term here, right? And so, because very often, yeah, I want to say this. I deliberately tried to intervene in my attraction radar so that it shifted off what was coming naturally to me, romantic bullshit, onto these what tended to be background markers that were predictive, like they'll pay more attention to this and therefore find the opposite of this more attractive. Right? Now you can't just will that, but you can try and you can use Agnes Keller. You can aspire towards it. You can acquire a taste you don't currently have, and it takes the combination of sort of experimenting with what are these cues that aren't salient for me that are nevertheless predicting. What might be some alternative cues that predict a more satisfying partnership, and I tried to shift my attraction radar onto that, and that seemed to work for me.
Like always swiping left on Snapchat filters.
I don't know what that means. I don't use Snapchat. So, yeah, I mean, so just to get, so I don't want to get too personal, and I don't, but I tend to, and this is, I'm not making any metaphysical claims here. I tended to be very attracted to blondes. And I noticed that was too salient for me. And so I then made a choice. I'm not going to look at anybody. So it's an overcompensation, but it was the bias was so pervasive. I said, no, I'm not going to look at anybody that's blonde, because I want other things to have a chance to get a purchase on me, because that was overshadowing so much. And it's a useless predictor. It doesn't predict anything, right? I understand that this is a Darwinian thing, because it might be predictive of sort of, genetic health, and that's why it's sort of attractive. And there might be sort of Protestant European thing going on historically. But you know what? I basically want to give those things the finger, because they're not helping me. They're not helping me. So that's what I tried to do. And again, I'm not setting myself up as an authority on this. I'm just trying to answer your question as honestly as I can.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Thank you.
That's super useful.
Thank you for doing that.
Yeah. So we've been talking a lot about love in modern society and various manifestations of foolishness that we see around us. So now we're going to go for a bit of a change of pace and zoom out and take a look at the more transcultural aspect of romantic love and see how it might connect to the deep machinery of what it is to be human. And hopefully, in doing that, we might come to some kind of maybe positive prescription of how might we carry out love, dating, and romance in the modern world in a different way.
So the first thing I want to say is we should now shift to your interviewing, because the person who should be in my spot right now is my friend and colleague Jeff McDonald, because one of the things that is really unfortunate is Jeff and I had one of the same kind of thing I had with Jordan Peterson and what I had with Dan Dolderman. Jeff McDonald and I had one of those masterminds or whatever called public discussions about love. And
awesome. I'll have to go check that out.
No, it was lost.
It was lost?
The recording got messed up.
Oh, what a shame.
Oh, no.
Yeah, that's the correct response. That is the correct response. I'm hoping that maybe he and I could do something again. And Jeff has a line, and the fact, and Jeff and I have become friends, pretty good friends, and I have a lot of respect and affection for Jeff. And I've sort of asked him about this, and he sort of said, yeah, that my suspicions were right. He says that attachment series is the way, the truth, and the life about relationships. And I don't know if you guys know it because of biblical illiteracy. He's actually alluding to a quote from the Bible, from the book of John, where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And then Jeff is invoking. So he's invoking the stuff we've been talking about, how Romanticism has sort of co-opted religious machinery and tries to take the role, but then he's subverting it by pointing to an actual scientific theory that we should be paying great attention to. And I just think that's really brilliant. And it's rhetorically brilliant, and it bespeaks. He describes himself as a contrarian, but he's such a playful and insightful contrarian, and that's just there. And I think that's something really important, and he's a better person to talk to about this. Like, we have to pay attention to, and this is where we can make use of the work of Siegel and Hutto and others about how constitutively necessary and formative of personhood attachment relationships are. And that we carry that with us deeply in the grammar of our developmental needs. And so that it informs and inflects and can distort all of the relationships we pursue, not just romantic relationships, but also friendships in very, very powerful way.
Can you just briefly summarize what the theory of attachment series is?
Yeah. So let's go back and this, and then what I just want to make a connection to something we said earlier. One of the things I did in the discussion with Jeff is I sort of took these ideas he was giving about attachment and brought in some of the stuff we've been talking about, agape, as person making, and also the Vygotskian stuff that we could talk a bit about. And that was, I think we both felt that was a very fruitful, conjoining. Sorry, I just used a conjugal metaphor there.
Excellent.
So attachment theory is, the idea that we're, for very important, the fact that we're not the product of an intelligent designer, but evolution, which was, sort of, the problem about evolution is language makes us talk about it as if it's a teleological agent, and it is not. Two more times. It is not. Okay. So, but nevertheless, what happens is there's selection for big brains and there's selection for bipedalism. Those are in conflict with each other. Bipedalism keeps the pelvis narrow. Big brain needs the pelvis to widen. And so we have this horrible thing where we're often kill the mother, and we're born ridiculously premature, and most of the brain's growth is taking place outside. This also gives time for our other big need, which is we need to learn culture, because it's our big, hugest, overwhelming adaptation. So for all of these reasons, we're born helpless, and what that means, and so we need something to devote itself to us and turn us into a cultural being. And you can see how agape fits into there right away. But that bonding, that like sort of psychologically primordial bonding that makes the agape possible, that gets the parent committed to the child and the child like receptively oriented in a adaptive way to the parent, that bonding, that's the attachment relationship. And man, you feel it when you have a kid. Like it's a powerful experience. I remember, especially for my first son, right? Like having a kid is horrible. Sorry, let me like for the first 3 months, it's one of the like it's horrible because like it's, and that's why communities used to surround and support, people who had a newborn child, because it is just so it's just it's impacting you and on levels you don't even understand. Like it calls out egocentrism you weren't even aware with, like, and it's your health is suffering and your relationship with your beloved is suffering. And it's just like, oh, what have I done? Like, what have I done? Right. And you know, and anybody who claims, I'm just deeply suspicious of anybody who claims they don't come to parts where they're sitting up at 3 a.m. and the child has now been asleep for maybe 47 seconds. And they're like, what have I done? What have I done? Right. And what happens about 3 months in, you're getting to that fatigue and then the child smiles at you. And it's a real smile. It's not like a gas bubble smile. It's a real smile. There's eye contact. There's a smile. And then you can feel it. You can feel this like whoosh run through your brain. And you just go, wow, I'm so glad I did this. That's attachment. Whoa. Right? It's like, and it's evolutionary necessary, because if your parents don't commit to you for a long time, 15 years, you aren't going to be viable. And you're born absolutely helpless. You're a helpless, like, at least cognitively, non-person that has to be tended and cared for and protected until personhood. And that's minimally 15 years. And that's a dramatic cost. So what we have is, it looks like we've evolved for machinery that makes us, the parent, deeply attached to the child, and the child, therefore, reciprocally deeply attached to the parent. And then the idea is that, of course, I'm talking about the ideal, but of course, there's all kinds of ways in which that can go better or worse. And what that does is that sort of ingrains into you, the attachment ingrains into you a fundamental template and grammar of how you understand, and I don't mean up here in introspection, I mean in enactive cognition, how you understand relationships. So like if you were anxiously attached, that's to your parents, like in which they were giving you, ambivalent signals about wanting to be in the attachment relationship, you're going to carry that anxious attachment into your romantic relationships. And there's just lots of empirical evidence for this. And people don't like to hear this because they want to believe the romantic bullshit that it's all just a matter of will and choice and my impulsive attraction to a person. Look, your brain it seeks to predict. It prefers predictive unhappiness over unexpected happiness. It will seek out familiarity at the expense of taking a risk. In fact, there's ways in which certain options won't even become salient to you, even though those are the good choices to make, precisely because your brain is going, and this sounds creepily Freudian, but I'll speak first. Obviously, this is not occurring in my introspective awareness, so I'm giving voice to something that doesn't actually speak in my mind. But, hey, she's a lot like Mom. And she's making me sad the way Mom did. I'm going to be with her. Because she's making me sad the way Mom does. And so I understand that because it's my only way of predicting relationships, because that's the only grammar I have. And so I'll keep getting involved with these women that make me sad. Because Mom made me sad. Or I'm anxious and I'm ambivalent. I got ambivalent. So I was constantly having to seek out Mom and make sure she still loves me. And I'm going to carry that into my romantic relationship. And that's what I meant earlier about you got to get some serious self-knowledge. You got to really figure out what your attachment style was and what it is. And, you can't change it by a matter of will or belief. You have to go through, and Jeff would back this up 100%. You have to go through deep therapy to change your attachment styles. Like you do. It's not, you can't just, I don't want to do that anymore. Because what you'll find, and this is so maddening, right? You'll find, I'm doing this. I'm going to do the opposite of what I've done before. I'm going to look for people, and I do this. Wait, I've done it again. I've done it again. I'm with the same kind of person. Again, the very attempt to do the opposite, right, made possible ending up, here I am again. That's how powerful and profound attachment theory is. And you can't get away from it because it's just wired in. But you don't, and if you are in either the having mode, which locks you into holding on, or romanticism, you are not going to get free from any of the ways in which the attachment machinery is screwing up your life. You're not going to get free. The romanticism and or the having mode stuff is just going to lock you in, and you are not going to ever be free. You have to be willing to commit to bringing in sapience, getting into dialogos with a therapist, pursuing new psychotechnology, increasing your self-understanding. You've got to go through a lot to address that machine. That's why I say, people who enter into a lot of these innovations and have not pursued this kind of deep self-awareness, they're really overestimating their capacities.
Yeah, it seems like you almost need kind of an eightfold path in order to break you out of this parasitic processing.
Yeah, I think you need something like, there's a book out there that I read when I was dating called If the Buddha Dated, which was, to try to bring things like the Eightfold Path to bear on this. This is why you see, in the Socratic framework, there's such a deep interpenetration of these three things, of eros, love, the cultivation of wisdom, and the realization of self-knowledge. And all of this is happening within collective rationality. That's why those are all wedded together so deeply and profoundly in the Socratic practice. We should definitely, people should definitely read If the Buddha Dated, but we should also write a book If Socrates Dated, or something like that, to also bring in some of that machinery to help us.
So I wanted to bring up something before. I'm not sure if this is related to this section or the last section, but I think it's important. It's the idea that it seems to me that an important aspect of meaning is, and it's really simple, it's how long you spent doing something and how much effort you put into it. And you alluded to this when you were talking about the effort that it requires to raise a child. Basically, I think if raising a child were easy, then the sense of meaning that you get when the child smiles at you wouldn't be as profound. I think a lot of it is exactly because you put all of that, because you went through that hell, essentially. And so it's almost like capitalism is making things so easy for us that we can't, like, it's almost impossible to like put a lot of effort into something.
Yeah, it's in one sense. In another sense, and this is what Hahn talks about in his books on like the scent of time and the agony of eros, a book about eros I would recommend, is that, but we've also moved to the achievement culture where, and this is where he gives a very strong critique of Foucault, in which people don't need to be oppressed. All we have to do is get them into an achievement culture, and then they will just self-exploit themselves to burnout and death. We don't have to oppress them. And so there's ways in which things are also made really, really hard for people. They're incapable, that's why he calls it the agony of eros. They can't enter into a relationship to the other because they are so deeply invested in self-exploitation. The other thing I would say, so that's one thing to bring into what we're talking about. The other thing is the phenomena you're pointing to, it overlaps with a kind of bias, which is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is that there should be we don't like it when our actions and our beliefs when it has to be in awareness. When our actions and our beliefs are antithetical. And we resolve it either by changing our actions, changing our beliefs, or bullshitting ourselves. Those are the three strategies, right? The thing about cognitive dissonance is exactly that, because you get people to find a task that they find really menial and tedious, like moving pegs around on, and then you make it really, so they have to put a lot of effort into it. And so what cognitive dissonance will kick in and say, because you put a lot of effort into it, it must have been valuable. And so you have to be really careful about that. You have to be really, really careful that independent of just, I put a lot of time into it, therefore it's valuable. Do you have other measures of why it's meaningful to you? So, yeah, I understand what you're saying. And there's a sense in which I'm not saying that you shouldn't ever pay attention to how much effort you've put in, because it is something to pay attention to, because you might step back and say, oh, maybe this thing is valuable because it needs so much effort. That's legitimate. But just to accept that heuristic, it's like, oh, therefore it must be valuable. That's to let it become a bias for you. So what I recommend is like, yeah, in addition to, I worked hard a lot on this and therefore it might be valuable. Bring that up. Legitimate, but without automatically falling prey to the bias of cognitive dissonance. Ask yourself, well, do I have other ways of, independent of that converge on this being meaningful. And then you have to be rational about this because, confirmation bias will kick in and oh yes, here's all the other stuff that confirms that it's meaningful. So you might want to look for, is there any evidence that it's actually not very meaningful?
Yeah, right. That bias surely plays into a lot of relationship problems.
Yes, very much. So that bias and the sunk cost fallacy both kick in. It's valuable because I put so much time into it, and also, the sunk cost fallacy. I've invested so much on it, I'm going to lose it all if I don't stay. So yeah, those both kick in.
Honestly, one of the most terrifying things to me in thinking about the future and romantic relationships is, at least my perception is, a huge percentage of the quote unquote successful marriages that I see seem to be just operating on the sunk cost fallacy. And that's all.
Yeah, that can definitely be the case. I've talked to Jeff about this, and I hope my hope is rational hope. So that's kind of a weird meta hope. And this is why I said we've got to get good. So we've got to get the self-knowledge. We also have to have the science, and then we also have to have the practices, the ecology of practices. We have to get good at all three loves, at Eros, Philia, and Sophia, and Agape. Sorry, I was putting Philia, Sophia together. Sorry. Philia and Agape. Although Sophia matters too, I suppose. and so my understanding, and this is again something that I've tried to foreground this time around, is the long-term relationships, the ones that aren't just sunk cost fallacy, and I'm really acknowledging that's a thing. I'm not denying that at all, right? But Jeff says that what you get is, right, the philia, people will say, I'm staying with this person because they're my very best friend, right? And so notice what we are not talking about at all well in our culture, and what the romantic comedies are absolutely useless about. And we need to talk about it more. And I think this goes back to our point about the manosphere. I love that word, by the way. What we're not talking about in any really deep way, and there's no excuse because we have Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics, and, we're not talking about friendship. What do you do to be, how do you get good at being a friend? And who's helping you to first of all bring that question up, then frame it properly, formulate it properly, and then guide you to trying to aspire and go through the developmental trajectory of becoming a good friend. Because you think you're just naturally good at friendship. You're about as naturally good at friendship as you are naturally good at anything else that's complex and difficult within a very complex environment, which is you're not very good at it, right? And so we confuse things together. I make a distinction between a buddy and a friend. A buddy is somebody that is fun to be with. You do fun. They're fun to do. You have fun together, and you should have buddies. Of course you should, right? But a friend, a friend is somebody that you are. You're bound together. Aristotle said it's like one soul, one self in two people. You're bound to them because you are committing to each other's becoming better persons. So a friend should be somebody who helps you seek the truth and the good and the beautiful and seek how you should seek that. And we don't talk about any of that. And again, we lost that. And Romanticism was shit in talking about friendship because it's the rugged, tortured individual, right? But there was something analogous, again, within Christianity. There was fellowship. So fellowship was this thing that bound people together within Agape and was was an intermediary between friendship and Agape. And so it bound philia of friendship to the Agape of the community. You had fellowship. So you had Agape, and you had philia, friendship, and you had fellowship. And this was and then you had guidance in all three of those being modeled to you. And we have none of that. We have none of that, right?
So are you advocating for the idea that the person that you're romantically involved with should be like a really good friend?
Yes. In fact, I think you should. I don't want to speak too, enjoy the initial months of, infatuation, and you just have to touch the person a lot and all that sort of stuff, right? Enjoy that. Again, it's one of the, it's a lot of fun. But if you want a long-term relationship, I think all three loves should be seriously cultivated in a mutually informing fashion. You should really know how to pursue eros well. What does it mean to try and join, integrate, unify? Because that's what eros is driving you towards. What does that mean with a person? I know what it is to unify with a cookie. I eat it, right? But a person isn't the kind of thing that a cookie is. So what does eros mean there? And then, of course, there's agape, right? Because one of the things we're doing, and this is how agape and phileo overlap, is one of the things I'm doing is I'm committing, right, to I'm committing to caring for the conditions of her meaning making. Right? I'm committing to that. That's agape. Right? I'm going to commit to the conditions under which Sarah can make meaning and come into personhood. And then there's philia, friendship, and she commits to mine, and then we have a reciprocal relationship. We have reciprocity in the mutuality of the agapic relationship, where we are pursuing, we're pursuing a bond in which we are mutually affording development along the being mode. The pathway from within the being mode. And so I think if you have all of those, again, I'm not giving you an algorithm. I don't think this can be rendered into an algorithm. I don't offer rules, 12 rules or whatever. I'm trying to offer you tools, not rules, right?
12 Tools for Life by John Vervaeke.
So I think that but I think if people were really pursuing wisdom, the self-knowledge and the knowledge of, the difference between intelligence and rationality, and individual intelligence and collective rationality, all that we talked about that, and then bringing it in so that they got a developmental trajectory that's self-correcting and self-transcending, whereby they are cultivating the three loves with a deep understanding in a relationship. I think that could portend a long-term and also satisfying relationship that is not just held together by romantic bullshit or some institution or the sunk cost fallacy.
I wanted to say, I think the distinction that you made between friendship and buddyship is really important, especially with this notion that's often repeated that your spouse, if you're going to have a spouse, should be your best friend. Yeah. I think I was taking that the wrong way. I was hearing friend like buddy, and yes. I don't know if that's the case, that your spouse needs to be your best buddy. How do you feel about the relationship between love and buddyship, or do you think it's important that a romantic relationship be a really strong buddy also?
Yeah, no, I don't think when I say best friend, I'm using that in contradistinction to best buddy.
Right.
I don't think your partner should be your best buddy. So I think I'm in total agreement with how you're applying the distinction. Now, I want to bring a nuance into that. I think because, again, things get commodified and therefore locked down. The buddy is somebody you play with, but there's different kinds of play. There's there's the more frivolous play in buddyship, and then what I call serious play, because play is also a developmental thing. That's how a lot of development works. And so there should be an aspect of serious play within your romantic relationship, but it's not the same kind of play that you do when you're playing with when you're playing with your buddies. Because the goal isn't the generation of fun, the serious play within a relationship, but it's still nevertheless playful. It's about the kind of play in which you're inducing wonder, you're affording aspiration, you're platforming self-transcendent for the other person, and they're reciprocating. It's important that you don't want to be overly Protestant about your long-term relationship. You don't want to think of it, it's all just work, right? Mm-hmm. That's what I'm trying to get at. It's not. But I think, I don't think you're like, there's going to be lots of things that are buddy activities that is probably, in fact, not a good idea to include your spouse or your partner. Right? I agree with that wholeheartedly. The one nuance I want to put in is I didn't want the buddy to have the sole privilege of play. I think that's a mistake.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. I mean, it sort of gets at this idea that I was thinking about a bit while I was listening to your lectures yesterday, and you alluded to it earlier, is like this idea of like the romantic partner, like when you were discussing symbols in your lecture series, and sort of how, I'm not going to articulate it as well as I'm sure you're about to, but you talked about how people interact and play with a symbol and how it's like this reciprocal process. And it really reminded me a lot of how, like, what romantic love is like. Yeah, I mean, maybe you can speak to that a bit.
Yeah, so, I mean, and again, this is a Platonic notion when I went back where instead of idealizing your romantic partner, you can engage with them in the serious play of them being symbolic, them being an icon. And I'm using that not just in the iconic sense, but in the religious sense, like in Eastern Orthodoxy, where there's icons. And the icon, right, what's his name? The guy who wrote God Without Being. Oh, his name is escaping me right now. Because he makes a distinction between the idol, is it Marion? Anyways, he makes a distinction, Jean-Luc Marion, I think it is. He makes a distinction between the idol and the icon. Yeah. So the idol, like, it fixes your gaze and you get a kind of a saturation, right? Right? And it's again a having thing, right? Whereas the icon is always beckoning you beyond. So, the icon provokes wonder rather than satisfying curiosity. It puts you into mystery rather than giving you security, all those kinds of things. And so if you enter into the serious play, because serious play is what you need to go through transformative experience to engage in aspiration, because you can't reason your way. I want to be very careful here. You can't infer your way through a transformation. And I give arguments for that in the series. Based on the work of L.A. Paul, great work, and the excellent work also of Agnes Callard and others. You need serious play to get you through those, and that's why children do it, right? I think if you enter into mutual serious play with your romantic partner, they can be, in the sense I've tried to stipulate, they can become iconic for you. They can become symbolic. And this is so a clear example of serious play in which the other becomes iconic for you is Tantra. Both Tantric, both the Hindu version and the Buddhist version of Tantra. Because it's about serious play, in which your beloved becomes, right, an icon for you about the mysterious depths of being, and in a way in which you can directly confront it directly, and I mean this in all of its embodiment, you can directly face it and come into an active participation with it. And then you can use that framework to take it into the deepest levels of your psyche and your brain by coupling it to erotic behavior. And so, I'm not an expert in this. I'm just learning about it and reading it. And many people confuse Tantra. They think it's about learning how to be a sexual athlete so you can sort of, prolong an orgasm for 6 hours or something like that. That's not what it's about. It's about the serious play that allows you to enter into a participatory conformity with your partner so that they become iconic and you become iconic for them, of a developmental pathway into the heart of the mystery of being. That's what it's about.
So it sounds like you're kind of, both people are mutually using each other as symbols or icons.
I just want to change the verb from using to playing with.
Sure. Okay. So people are mutually playing with each other, as icons. Yeah. And so they're kind of a lens or something that they're looking through reality at, and they're getting this participatory, knowledge of the world.
Because think about how these two come together. So in love, as opposed to lust, what's happening? And again, Jeff would be better on this, but this is what the research shows. You engender love by mutually accelerating disclosure. Mm-hmm. So I disclose something about me. I reveal, rather than controlling and manipulating, I reveal something about me, often something that's a vulnerability. And if you reciprocate and, right, disclose aspects about you, so you come more into the being mode in front of my eyes and disclose, right? If we start to do this, if we get mutually accelerating disclosure, that's what it is to fall in love. But that's also the machinery of anagogic self-transcendence. This is Plato's great insight. I see more deeply into reality. It discloses itself more to me. And then that takes me more deeply into the machinery of the psyche. It gets rearranged, right? So that gets disclosed transformatively. And then I'm now oriented more deeply towards reality. And the thing, it does that mutually accelerating disclosure. It's the opposite of the reciprocal narrowing in an addiction. It's the reciprocal opening up of anagogic self-transcendence. But that's also the machinery of love. And so that's what Tantra was on about. And that's what Plato was on about. That's what's going on in the symposium. Anagogic, the anagogic ascent to the good is bound up with the reciprocal disclosure of love.
Cool. So I wanted to bring up something that we talked about earlier, which is opponent processing. And I wanted to tie that together with something that we've been talking about on some of our previous episodes, which is this idea of the polarity between the masculine and the feminine. Right. And I thought that it kind of struck me when I heard the idea of opponent processing. I was like, oh, it seems like there's this bioeconomy, and we have on the one hand resilience, and on the other hand efficiency. It seems like maybe the masculine is sort of in charge of one, and the feminine is in charge of the other. Do you agree with that?
I don't know. That's a great idea. I mean, I don't want to answer right now because that's just a really good idea, and I feel it would be disrespectful to just answer. Maybe let's yeah. The idea that instead of trying to tie it down to sort of biological sexual reproduction organs or something like that, we understood, because this would also be profound and primordial, we understood masculinity and femininity more towards, like you say, some of the constitutive constraints on our bioeconomy and a preferential structuring of the virtual engine so that you're not only getting, the opponent processing within individuals, but within the distributed cognition. That's what you're proposing, right, Chris? Is it something like that?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I think that's bloody brilliant. I hadn't thought of that at all. And that would be an interesting and alternative way of trying to ground this that could perhaps take it out of the politically fraught way in which we're wrestling with these terms and link it to the guts of the meaning-making machinery. You should do something about that. That is brilliant. That is really good. I think that has real potential. I mean, I'm not in the place where I can just sort of endorse it, but I can endorse it as a really good idea that really should be taken seriously. I think that's really good.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I've also been thinking about the masculine feminine divide in the context of the political sphere, where it seems like there's always these two halves, and they're always they're working together, but they're also fighting, and that as you said. In politics, we have opponent processing, is what you said, and that if we don't trust each other, then the self-corrective nature kind of falls apart.
Exactly, and then it becomes the adversarial zero-sum game, winner take all, and then you get a conquest mentality being brought into sexuality, which is what, of course, all the players, right? That the player mentality is the conquest mentality brought into relationships, right? So it's a zero-sum game. I've got to conquer. That's the only way to get, that's the only good possible, because that's the only goal that makes sense within an adversarial setup. There was a metaphor that was striking me earlier when we were talking about how our political system is going from kind of a opponent processing to an adversarial position. You brought up a metaphor of like a body where your different body systems, like your limbic system and then your rational system, aren't or shouldn't be fighting against each other. They should be helping each other process. But in the body, if you go from opponent processing of different systems to like an adversarial thing, that's literally what cancer is when one... Yes. Yeah. one thing becomes a winner take all.
Yeah.
The clearest example, and it's directly relevant to this coupling to the environment, is the opponent processing between the opponent processing that's constitutive of the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic meaning self-regulating, self-governing, self-ruling, right? Autonomos. Between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic system that's constantly calibrating, constantly evolving in this embodied, embedded, inactive fashion, the level of arousal. So your arousal is appropriate to the task at hand. And it's opponent processing. But what we can get is we can skew it. Imagine if the sympathetic system tried to kill the parasympathetic system. Sort of, right. This would be like stress on meth, right? And you would be just always hyper aroused and you would just die. I think that's exactly right. And cancer is another example of the opponent processing. The self-correction is giving way to an adversarial winner take all.
I've heard the cancer metaphor used in the political arena recently, especially you'll hear a lot of people say like the men's rights movement is cancer or feminism is cancer. And I wonder if we're...
I think if it brought your insight to bear, that would be great. In that it's like, and we should be dropping out of adversarial processing. I'm worried that it's just a purity code term for how we can cut out the thing we don't like. I just want to give a bit of credit where credit is due. I mean, I've been developing this idea about opponent versus adversarial. But it originally goes back to work that Leo and Ferraro I did when he was working with me on my relevance realization theory. He said, all this opponent processing stuff you're talking about biologically, that should be understood as relevant to the political domain. So I just wanted to give him credit here before things got going too far.
I don't know. Have we defined opponent processing?
So let's do it concretely with what I proposed to as a good exemplification, which is the autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic part of the nervous system is biased. It's trying to interpret as many signals as possible as the signals that your level of arousal should be increased. So its goal is trying to collect in a biased fashion, right, as much evidence that arousal should be increased, right? The parasympathetic system also is biased. It's trying to collect as much evidence to reduce your level of arousal. Now, you need to raise your level of arousal, like if you need to fight something, you need to climb, or need to lift, or there's all kinds of reasons, right? And then but you also need to reduce your level of arousal to heal, to rest, to recuperate, right? Right? And so they're pursuing opposing goals, but they're linked. They're not independent from each other. So as the sympathetic system, right, is pulling you in one direction, it's trying to shut off the parasympathetic system, and the parasympathetic system is also trying to shut off, right, the sympathetic system, but it's so designed that they can't shut each other off. So what they're doing is constantly pulling and pushing on each other so that you have a dynamical system that is constantly recalibrating your level of arousal. And you're getting a somewhat good interpretation of the environment precisely because of the opponent processing between them. You're pitting biases against each other so that they self-correct within a self-correcting calibration. And that's how... Now, is it a perfect system? No, it's not, but there is no perfect system possible. But it's way better than the sympathetic system winning out, or the parasympathetic system winning out, or the parasympathetic system saying, my way of seeing things is the only way, etc.
Wow.
Okay, so they're honestly embodying kind of two personalities that are opposed, but their opposition produces better results.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to give them the status of personalities, but something like that. They're, a way of framing information and interpreting it, and a way of thereby trying to affect the level of arousal. Yes.
Wow, that's so interesting. Like, maybe my brain is drawing spurious connections here, but it almost seems to me like the Republicans are the parasympathetic system, where they're like, no, everything is fine, let's just leave it how it is. And the Democrats are like the sympathetic nervous system, and they're like, everything is terrible, we need to change.
It could be. I don't know. Or maybe at different times, because the Republicans can get very sympathetically triggering in that they, we're under threat and our borders are under threat, and they can do that sort of. So I think at different times they play to different things. But it could be that that what we had is a party that represented conservatism and trying to slow things down and calm things down so that we don't become too disconnected from the wisdom of our history and our traditions and our institutions. That was in opponent processing with another system that says, no, we need to grow, we need to develop, there are new problems, and that's trying to promote restructuring and trying to speed things up. I could see what you're saying, like where we had sort of, a kind of opponent processing between a conservative and a progressive group of parties, for lack of a better word. Yeah.
Right. I agree with you. Like, I think that the conservative and the progressive fits into that dichotomy pretty well, but maybe our Democrats and Republicans today aren't exactly the ideal of what we think of as conservatives or progressives. It seems like the important part of this, like if you're going to have a opponent processing type system, like whether it be within the body, in the body, like these are systems that literally evolved within the body, so you don't need psychological trust. But in a political system, people need to trust that both sides or everybody's working towards the good of the country. And if we want to bring it back to love, if you're in a fight or some kind of a battle, or maybe not a battle, but ideally opponent processing with your partner, both partners need to trust that you're working towards the good of the relationship. And it seems like what's happening a lot is just the trust has broken down.
And I think that's excellent. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, and let's remember, we used to call it the body politic. We used to call it the body politic, that the political world was something like a body, because there was an expressed symbolic commitment to the health, the commonwealth, the common health, all that sort of stuff, right? Now, the fact that trust is broken down, I think that's a very important thing to say. And part of it has to do with an issue about commodification, and also, again, there's sort of a decadent romanticism that we've lost. See, one of the things that reason does and how it differs from intelligence, and you can see how this goes into some of the stuff we were saying about the being mode. Reason cares about the process of your cognition and not just its results, not just its bottom line productions, not just the products. Mm-hmm. So, and Stanovich talks about this as one of the fundamental commitments to being rational is to value and care about the process itself. And so in a relationship, for example, my friendships, and also especially the relationship I have with Sarah, we have from the beginning a shared, and we constantly check in, a shared commitment to the process, to valuing the process, to valuing the communication process, to valuing the connection process, to spending time on, right? Let's sometimes it's serious play, sometimes it's more serious practice, but let's play and practice with the communication process itself, with the connection process itself, right? Independent of what outcome I want in situation X or what outcome she wants in situation X. There's so a lot of time on caring about and caring for the process, because that's the hallmark of rationality. And that's what I mean about how you could bring in sapiential rationality into your relationships. But if you're going in within the adversarial orientation is defined by not caring about the process at all. That's what makes it so fundamentally irrational. It's about winner take all. It's about winning. It's about the product. It's about the result. And what you need for trust and what you need for democracy and for the opponent processing to be self-correcting is you need people to have a deep, real commitment to the process. And that process, that commitment to that process is superordinate to and independent from their commitment to the particular results they're trying to achieve. And we used to have that. We used to have that people, right, could, and we're lucky in Canada because with minority governments, the parties are forced into that situation because they have to make the process work enough so they can stay in power long enough to get the results they want. It's pro tem, and I get that. But it's also why some of the best governing we've had, has been minority governments like Pierre Trudeau's 1972 and Peterson's ones in the 60s, right? Because people have to commit to the process. But if that became something that was not just expedient, but something that people deeply had internalized as a value, which people used to have, right? Then I think that would help to engender the trust. If I know you're committed to the process and not just to your goals, I know that there's a common ground that I can, in terms of which I can trust you. And that, right? And in terms of which real reciprocation is possible between us and real communication is possible between us. We, and this is the difference between substantive justice and procedural justice. And we're also too oriented towards substantive justice in our society. We want the just results. We want the just outcomes. And of course we should. I'm not saying that. But we're now getting to a point where people are talking politically about, I want that outcome and I don't care how it's achieved. Right. And all the issues of procedural justice is like, yeah, but how we achieve it is also independently something we have to value as a domain in which we pursue justice. How we pursue that just end is just as much something that comes under the normativity of justice as the results we're seeking. And so if we could get back to where we brought rationality into the political domain, meaning that we developed the personal sensitivity and sensibility to care about the process and not just the products, then I think we could start to get the grounding for the trust that is needed, that you're talking about.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I was thinking when you were talking about this process that's needed and like relating it back to love and relationships too, and romantic relationships specifically, and I'm using that purposely. It seems like romanticism kind of gives us a horrible setup for any kind of process, because the process for our romantic relationship working is just, did we choose the right person who's like completely divine? And that's
exactly. Exactly. I think that is really, really astute. Exactly. Yes. Very much.
Focus on the product rather than the process.
Right. And that's why it's happily ever after. That's why it's happily ever after.
Yeah.
Because, right?
Yeah. You're looking for a person who is some kind of end product that is just perfect for you, and then it's happily ever after, as opposed to looking for a person whose mental processes and like trajectory of growth and like who they are, the way that they take in information from the world and process it. You want to look for a process that you respect.
Yes, that's so well said. Stop looking for the one. Instead, look for a friend who can co-commit with you to the process of mutual development. Yes, exactly. That was very well said. Well done.
Thank you. All right. I feel a little bit better now. I feel a little bit better about like what to look for or not, honestly, after that.
So, I wanted to go back a little bit to when you talked about how in a functioning opponent process, basically there's two processes, both of which have essentially opposite biases. And so what that produces is it produces a situation in which one side can never really completely understand the other side, because they have different versions of reality almost. But this one has reality biased in this way, and this one has reality biased in this other way. But it seems like the interplay and the sort of the play or the competition is what produces the optimal outcome.
There's truth to that. I mean, to say that they don't understand each other, I think is a little too strong. I mean, because if they have the shared commitment to the process, they have a shared understanding of the grammar, of the communication. And so there's that. And also they should bring with it, if they're going to participate and commit, they should bring the shared understanding that they are both biased and they are both in need of self-correction.
Exactly.
And that facilitates not being isolated in the echo chamber, but reaching out and saying, if we could get Republicans and Democrats, right, for example, to say, here's a Republican, or whichever way, I really need you. The Republicans really need the Democrats, and vice versa, because of everything we've just said. Then, I mean, imagine, I understand what I'm being careful here, but I mean, this isn't like a grand utopic vision, but imagine what it would be like if we could just get there. That would be be so transformative. It would just be so transformative.
That would be amazing. That would be incredible. I think a lot of what's happened is like, creative fields, because of like the nature of the personality types that are drawn to them, creative fields tend to be dominated by liberals, especially in the US. And so like a lot of the maybe this sounds a little conspiratorial, but I think there is something to like liberal media bias. And so like the narrative is there's no respect for conservatives whatsoever. And like, I'm saying this as a person who leans pretty left, like culturally, and like grew up that way anyway. But
me too, totally. But I get that. There's a way in which CNN is complicit in Trump. Because yes, Trump is a liar and blah, blah, and all that sort of stuff. And the evidence is mounting that, I think he willfully violated both the letter and the intent of the Constitution. I'm not denying any of that. But the point is there's a complicity there because right from the beginning, they reflected back to him what he gives. He gives out contempt. And what do they reflect back to him? Contempt, right? And then it's like, okay, well, in terms of the process, I don't see any fundamental difference here. Now, they might say, well, there's no alternative because he's the president and you have to sort of fight fire with fire. But, that's not to take responsibility for how you got to where you are. Right?
You use the word contempt, and I think that's really important, and it's an interesting parallel too. I don't remember who did it, but I remember there was some study or someone who had worked with a lot of different couples, and their main number one insight, it was like a marriage counselor, and they said their number one predictor for whether a couple was going to stay together or break apart was if there was contempt. They're going to break up.
Anderson Todd, my dear friend, and often collaborator, and he's my partner in running the Consciousness and Wisdom Studies Lab, and he is a practicing therapist, and he says that repeatedly, and often, insightfully in a perspicacious manner, that the relationships can come back from. He's seen relationships can come back from infidelity and even people having in anger and intense conflict. They can't come back from contempt. Contempt is the death of relationship. That's
a little bit scary in the political context that we're talking about.
I'm deliberately trying to be provocative. And I want to point out one thing. What's happening, and this is even more scary, so I'm going to make it worse. Not only do we have contempt for the other side, there's growing and explicit contempt for the process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, if what you're saying is true, where respect for the process is the solution, where both sides acknowledge that they're biased and that the other side actually has the key to solving the bias, and then that both sides together see the whole picture, but neither side by itself sees the whole picture. And I do see like sort of a masculine feminine thing there too, like in a romantic relationship when you have two people, or in a body politic where you have millions of people, it seems to me that it functions the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Chris. It makes me think of something that's been bothering me a little bit since Katie made that point a little while ago about finding someone who's like a complementary process to you. Like, could this discussion we're having maybe point to some kind of insight into like how to wisely choose a partner? Is maybe you wisely choose someone who forms some kind of polarity with you, or who in some way their process brings out what's missing in yours?
You have to be careful about that because you don't want to. I mean, the opposite attract stuff is just not true. So there's a balance there. So I would say there has to be a lot of compatibility that is going to really strongly afford the shared commitment to the process. And then there has to be a respect for the diversity of perspectives and histories, right, and trajectories that the partners are bringing into the relationship. For example, let me give you where I think your point is very well stated, Ariel. I don't think it's. I don't think. People do this, and it doesn't seem to work a lot of the time. I don't think academics should marry other academics. There's too much. And so they often end up competing with each other, because there's too much, right? But, I also don't think, an academic would probably do very well, marrying a welder or something like that, because then there's not enough. It's like when I talk about optimal gripping. You've got to get the balance between the ability to pull back enough to differentiate, but you have to have enough similarity so you can integrate that, because that's how you're going to maintain a complex system. The two of you have to be able to significantly integrate and significantly differentiate. So I'm saying I think it's more nuanced than just getting sort of a polarity and complementarity. It's about, right, is there enough compatibility so that we can integrate, especially in our commitment to the processing, and valuing it and valuing each other. But can we also differentiate enough that the system, right, the system can self-correct, for the particular biases we bring to bear? It sounds to me that it has to be something more like that. More about trying to set up a virtual engine, in the relationship than just a sort of a polarity.
It does seem to me like if two academics got together, it could potentially work out if their competition, didn't turn adversarial. I think there's a line between where it's opponent processing and then adversarial processing. I think there's maybe a fine line there.
It could. That's fair, and that's a legitimate thing to say. I was just reporting what I frequently see. So, yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. I don't think it's deterministic in the sense that it's bound to get into competition. I think you're right. The degree to which people are capable of a self-awareness of the being mode, the degree to which they're capable of the process, the degree to which they're committed to a distributed cognition that's sapiential, all the stuff we've been talking about. Yeah, I think that could make it work. Very much.
Sort of playing rather than fighting.
Yes, serious play. Yes, very much. Yeah, I think I could see that being. Very much, but maybe it's also the case that that's just good for. I mean, if the argument we're making together is a solid one, that would be a good prescription. It sounds like for most relationships, if not all.
Yeah, agreed.
Is this like maybe this might just be like a romantic bias, but I have this idea that like it's cool how you put it. There's like an optimal grip between like the shared commitment and the like polarity and difference. And I have this intuition that like the polarity and difference is in some way associated with passion. Maybe that's just my romantic decadence, but
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know if I have the requisite. I've not put any reflective thought into that, so I don't know if I can bring any expertise to bear on it. I mean, the differentiation can also be driven by very sapiential developmental trajectories that people are on. Like, for example, it's very important to me that my partner is on a growth trajectory because that's a sort of fundamental to my grammar, right? My developmental grammar. But she doesn't have to be growing in the domain that I'm growing in, or right. But that has to be something so that, right, even though our paths of growth are different and differentiating us, we share the value of growth and self-transcendence, and then that brings us together and integrates. So we have stuff we can talk about in terms of the shared process, and then we have ways in which we bring different perspectives into the discussion because we're on our growth arcs are different. That's the kind of thing I'm sort of having in mind.
So I want to kind of support what Ariel said, and I want to talk about eros in the context of a romantic relationship. It seems to me that as long as you trust the other person, their consuming of you can actually increase your attraction to them. Like that's
so you're gonna have to untease that. You're gonna have to unpack that a bit.
Yeah. So as the Cheap Trick song says, I want you to want me.
Yes.
The fact that the other person is attracted to me is attractive. It makes me attracted to them. Yeah. Yes, and so there's this kind of mutual eros going on where we're kind of consuming each other, right? But it's not consuming us. It's creating a dynamic where stuff is getting created and destroyed.
Yeah. Well, maybe we could play with that a bit. Maybe what's being consumed is the difference between you and your, because that's what.
Ooh, good point.
Right. What's being consumed is the difference, because what's also happening is the mutually accelerating disclosure, which also differentiates the two of you, because you're, as you and the partner, disclose more in the mutually accelerating disclosure, they're their uniqueness and their particular idiosyncratic being in the world becomes more and more present in the situation. So while the distance is being consumed, there's a sense in which the differentiation is also being created in the mutually accelerating disclosure when things are working well, when there's an optimal grip occurring in the relationship.
And a trust in the process.
Very much, very much. And that's the right word. And it goes back to, again, our culture we haven't talked about this enough. Our culture has so impoverished all the other knowings beside propositional knowing. But all of this stuff we're talking about, this is da'ath, this is the proposition, this is not the propositional knowing. Da'ath is the participatory knowing, the knowing in which my knowing of you is inextricably bound up with my knowing of me. That I know you not with my mind or even with my state of consciousness. I know you through the way in which my identity is being transformed. And this is like central in the Socratic project, that the self-knowledge and the other knowledge are bound together because we're talking about participatory knowing. We're not talking about propositional or procedural. And obviously there's also the perspectival, because we've been talking about getting the perspectives to be in a proper relationship with each other. And because our culture is so impoverished, talking about, and this is for Cartesian reasons, I think, so impoverished in talking about even the procedural, but even more so, the perspectival and the participatory, we are so impoverished when we wanted to talk about trust. We think of trust in propositional terms. There was this point where I think it was Jordan Peterson talking about with Steven Pinker. That was odd. But anyways, but Paul Van der Klee made this point that Peterson is bringing up communing, trust, and Pinker immediately replaces it with contract, with social contract. The core of community is communing, and Pinker goes contract, which is a propositional entity, right? That is bound by logical normativity, as opposed to what we're talking about here, which is the co-cultivation of a dynamical system that has a life of its own that we both commit to, because of that. If it has that logos, it can help both of us transcend ourselves through each other and in agapic and philiac and erotic love with each other. And the fact that, but when Pinker did that, it's like, oh my gosh, can you leave the propositional stuff alone for just a minute? Everything doesn't have to be a contract. There are other ways in which human beings couple, conform, and bond, religio, to the world, other than through propositions.
Do you think that some of the problem and the reason why we're getting stuck in this like propositional sense of knowing is because like the systems that we're interacting with are so large and so far removed from us that there is no participating, really?
Yeah. So that's a real problem. I think again, it's incredibly insightful. It's difficult to get things that are comprehensive and abstract enough without relying on propositional knowing. Now, we have done it in the past. So we've had ways of organizing large people in a culturally and individually efficacious manner so that they could coordinate together. And religions did that. And religions were brilliant at scaling and this is Paul Van der Klee's idea, scaling the perspectival and the participatory such that they afforded vast social cultural organization and coordination and cooperation. So
yeah,
we have now. So and again, I am all for a separation of church and state. So Vervaeke wants to bring back the church.
Yeah,
that's not what's happening. That's not what's happening here. What I'm trying to show is the idea that the only way. And you can almost see why, if you're secular, it might, and Cartesian, it would seem like the only way you can get large scale coordination is through propositional processing and contracting, right? But what I'm trying to say is that that's simply not metaphysically the case. We have a clear and pervasive, both across time and culture, right, example of perspectival and participatory ritual and serious play as a ways of coordinating sociocultural organization.
Yeah, I wanted to, sorry, just one thing. I know we're supposed to be talking about love, but I've been stuck on it. But when we were talking about like the breakdown of trust in our society, I was trying to think through, okay, how could we try to repair it? And I basically came up with 3 potential ideas. One would be try to come back from contempt, which the relationship therapists seem to think is not very likely. The other would be to try to alter the system so that there's more trust in the system. And then the third is kind of what you were just talking about, which I know you've been bringing up a lot in your lecture series, especially lately, is like the religion that's not a religion.
Yeah, that's why. That's exactly right. That's why I've gravitated towards that. And that's why a lot of people are expressing a lot of interest in that idea, precisely because it looks like we need the functionality of religion, but for many people, the existing religions, especially the very creedal forms, which are propositionally oriented forms of this religion, no longer seem to carry that viable functionality that they're seeking. And so that's exactly why. I mean, there's a lot more here. And of course, you know that because there's a lot of argument there. But yeah, I think the connection you're making is exactly the connection I'm arguing for, that we need to take more seriously and we need to put a lot more work into. Yes, very much. So there might be some, that means there might be some very deep connections between the projects of trying to reformulate love and the religion of non-religion. Yeah, I think they are probably bound together in very important ways.
Wow. I think that's a good place to wrap up.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on our show. This was so much fun. Like time really flew. I was like, oh my God, are we ending already?
Yeah, really. Thank you so much. That was great.
I feel like we have so much more to talk about.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's good dialogos, right? Plato talks about this. It engenders in you this desire to procreate and keep giving birth to more ideas. Exactly. I feel exactly the same. I wish I didn't have to go off and work. I have to go off and write now and do some work because I want to just stay here and play with you guys because I'm having a wonderful time, and I think we're creating together a lot of really. I mean, you guys have made a lot of just really excellent connections that have, like, I keep going, wow, that's great. That's amazing. Like, this is what I mean about how we could bring in, right? You know, we could have sapiential distributed cognition, and the power it has, but how we can not just be sort of, we can bring it, we can activate it, engender it, and then we can make it more rational as opposed to just intelligent, and then turn it on to important topics like it used to happen in Socratic dialogue.
Well, of course, it was largely your Meaning Crisis series that got us all thinking about all this stuff. So thank you so much for putting that out too.
Yeah, definitely. We definitely recommend, if you're watching this, to check that out ASAP if you haven't already done so.
Yeah, here's a good opportunity for you. If you do you want to plug anything specific? Now?
I don't think I was doing it deliberately, but I just became aware. I was setting up a plug for the next series. Right? The next series is after Socrates, the cultivation of wisdom through authentic dialogue, authentic dialogos. And it's all about trying to get as clear as we can. So it's going to be a 20 episode series, a lot shorter than Awakening. And Ariel is going to be playing a significant role in the production of this series, which I'm very happy about. And so there's going to be a 10-part series, which is going to be more of a historical analysis about what was going on in Platonic dialectic, about bringing rationality into the intelligence, the collective intelligence of distributed cognition, and then bringing it to bear on, these topics, but in a perspectival and participatory way that not just gives us new ideas, but engenders in us new aspirations. Right. And then taking that and then putting it into, and a little bit of pun, playful pun is intended, putting it into dialogue with a lot of these current practices, like Guy Senstock's circling, or the stuff that Jordan Hall's talking about when he's talking about coherence, or, the work that's being done on insight dialogue, or Peter Lindbergh's notion of the anti-debate. All of these modalities that are arising as people are trying to access and participate in the transformative power of collective intelligence and all the stuff that Rebel Wisdom is doing right now. So that's the second half of the series. So that's how it's divided up into those two 2 blocks of 10 episodes each. So that's what's coming. And it's going to be, the first episode, hopefully, is going to be released February the 28th.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Well,
Yeah, we're definitely looking forward to that.
Yeah, I'm pumped. All right. Well, thank you so much, John. This was really wonderful.
I really think that what we did here together was very valuable. So thank you very much.
Absolutely agreed.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so this has been really cool. Thank you for coming on this this exploration with us. And if you like this content, definitely check out John's stuff and subscribe this channel, check out our Patreon, and we hope to see you next time.
Thanks for joining us on the Multiversity Project. We hope you found this episode both mind-bending and enjoyable.
We can be found all over the social media space and at multiversityproject.co.
If you like this content, give us a like, comment, follow, share, or support us on Patreon.
Catch you on the flip side.